What happens when a single father and his loyal dog discover a dying police officer in a Montana blizzard? The shocking truth they uncover will expose a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of power and put their entire family in mortal danger. Stay with me until the very end of this incredible story, and don't forget to comment with your city name so I can see how far this tale has traveled across the world. The Montana highway stretched endlessly before Owen Carter's weathered pickup truck, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the heart of a storm that seemed hell-bent on erasing the world. Snow whipped across his windshield in violent sheets, and the wipers struggled against the relentless assault of winter's fury. In the passenger seat, his 8-year-old daughter Penny pressed her nose against the cold glass, her breath fogging the window as she traced patterns with her small fingers. "Daddy, I can't see anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind that rattled the truck's frame. Owen's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his jaw clenched with the concentration of a man who knew that one wrong move on these treacherous roads could cost them everything. "I know, sweetheart. Just a few more miles to Grandma's house." Behind them, Scout, their golden retriever, shifted restlessly in the back seat, his ears perked and alert. The dog had been acting strange all afternoon, whining and pacing, as if sensing something Owen couldn't perceive. Now Scout's dark eyes were fixed on the storm outside his body, tense with an anticipation that made Owen's skin crawl. The blizzard had come out of nowhere, transforming what should have been a routine 2-hour drive to visit Owen's mother into a nightmare journey through what felt like the end of the world. The radio had died an hour ago, cutting off their last connection to civilization, and Owen's cell phone showed no signal, just empty bars mocking him from the dashboard mount. "Scout's being weird," Penny observed, turning to look at their dog. "He keeps making that noise." Owen glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Scout's lip curled slightly, not in aggression, but in something else, a kind of focused intensity he'd never seen before. The dog was practically vibrating with tension, his golden coat bristling despite the warmth of the truck's heater. "He probably just doesn't like the storm," Owen replied, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Scout had weathered plenty of Montana winters, and severe weather had never affected him like this. The truck's headlights carved 2 weak cones of light through the swirling snow, illuminating perhaps 10 feet of road ahead. Not nearly enough at the 30 miles per hour Owen was maintaining. Any faster would be suicide on these ice-slicked curves that wound through the mountain passes of Glacier County. Owen Carter was 34 years old, though the lines around his eyes and the premature gray threading through his dark hair made him look older. 2 years ago, cancer had stolen his wife Sarah, leaving him to raise Penny alone while working double shifts at the lumber mill just to keep their heads above water. He was tired, bone-deep, soul-crushing tired, but he was also determined. Penny was all he had left of the woman who'd been his whole world, and he'd move mountains to keep her safe. "Daddy, look." Penny's voice cut through his dark thoughts. Owen followed her pointing finger to see a dim glow off to the right side of the highway. Not the warm yellow of house lights, but something else. Something wrong. "What is that?" Penny pressed her face closer to the window. Before Owen could answer, Scout erupted. The dog's calm demeanor shattered like glass as he began barking frantically, his paws scrambling against the back window, trying to get out. His barks weren't the playful sounds Owen was used to. These were urgent, almost desperate. "Scout, settle down," Owen commanded, but the dog ignored him completely, something that had never happened before. Scout was the most obedient animal Owen had ever known, trained by Sarah before her illness to be gentle and responsive around Penny. This wild behavior was completely out of character. The strange light flickered again, and Owen realized with growing dread that it wasn't stationary. It was the emergency flashers of a vehicle barely visible through the storm sitting at an odd angle about 50 yards off the highway. "Someone's in trouble," Owen muttered, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Every instinct screamed at him to keep driving, to get Penny to safety, to not stop in the middle of nowhere during the worst blizzard he'd seen in years. But Sarah's voice echoed in his memory, as clear as if she were sitting beside him. "You can't walk past someone who needs help, Owen. That's not who we are." Scout's barking intensified, and the dog actually threw himself against the back window, hard enough to make the glass rattle. His golden fur was standing on end, and his dark eyes were fixed on that distant flashing light with laser focus. "Daddy Scout wants us to stop," Penny said, her small hand reaching back to touch the frantic dog. "He's trying to tell us something." Owen pulled the truck to the side of the road, his heart hammering against his ribs. The wind immediately grabbed at the vehicle, rocking it back and forth like a toy. Through the passenger window, he could barely make out the shape of what looked like a police cruiser, its front end buried in a snowbank, emergency lights painting the storm in alternating red and blue. "Stay in the truck," he told Penny, firmly grabbing his heavy winter coat from behind the seat. "No matter what happens, you stay right here with the doors locked. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, you call 911 if you get signal." "But Daddy..." "No arguments, Penny. I mean it." Owen opened the door and was immediately assaulted by wind so fierce it nearly knocked him backward. Snow pelted his face like tiny bullets, and the cold was so intense it took his breath away. He pulled his coat tight and started toward the wrecked cruiser, each step a battle against the storm. Behind him, Scout's barking reached a fever pitch, and Owen heard the distinctive sound of the truck's back door opening. He spun around to see the golden retriever leap from the vehicle and bound through the snow toward the crash site, his powerful legs carrying him faster than Owen could manage in the deep drifts. "Scout, no!" Owen shouted, but his words were swallowed by the wind. Penny closed the door. He could see his daughter struggling with the heavy door, her small frame no match for the fierce wind. With a curse that would have earned him a lecture from Sarah, Owen turned and followed Scout's path through the snow, his boots slipping on the hidden ice beneath. The police cruiser was worse than it had appeared from the road. The front end was completely crumpled against a massive pine tree, and spiderweb cracks spread across the windshield. The driver's side door hung open at an unnatural angle, and Owen's blood ran cold when he realized that the red flashing wasn't just from the emergency lights. Some of it was reflecting off something dark and wet in the snow. Scout had reached the vehicle ahead of him, and was now digging frantically in the snow near the open door, his powerful paws sending white powder flying in all directions. The dog's barking had changed to a high-pitched whine, urgent and desperate. "What is it, boy?" Owen gasped as he reached the crash site, his lungs burning from the cold air. That's when he saw her. Half buried in the snow about 10 feet from the cruiser, lay a woman in a police uniform, her body twisted at an angle that made Owen's stomach clench. Blood stained the snow around her head, dark and shocking against the pristine white. Her face was pale as death lips already tinged blue from the cold, but as Owen dropped to his knees beside her, he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. Barely. "Jesus." Owen breathed, his training from his volunteer firefighter days kicking in. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman didn't respond, but Scout was beside her now, his warm body pressed against her side, instinctively trying to share his body heat. The dog looked up at Owen with intelligent eyes that seemed to say, "Help her." Owen pulled off his heavy coat and wrapped it around the unconscious officer, then began checking her for injuries. Her badge read Detective R. Brooks, and she appeared to be in her early 30s with short, dark hair matted with blood from a head wound that had already stopped bleeding. Her right arm was bent at an unnatural angle, definitely broken, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. "Detective Brooks." Owen tried again, gently patting her cheek. "Can you hear me? I'm going to get you help." He pulled out his cell phone, praying for a miracle, but the screen still showed no signal. They were in a dead zone miles from the nearest cell tower, with a blizzard that would prevent any emergency vehicle from reaching them for hours. The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with pain and cold. Her lips moved, trying to form words, but only a whisper of breath emerged. "Don't try to talk," Owen said, leaning closer to hear. "Save your strength." Had to run," she managed, her voice barely audible. They tried to." Her eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness again. Owen's blood turned to ice water. They tried to what? This wasn't just a traffic accident. Someone had hurt this woman, left her to die in the storm. But who and why? Scout whined and pressed closer to the injured officer, his thick coat providing desperately needed warmth. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation in a way that made Owen's chest tight with emotion. Sarah had always said that Scout was special, more intuitive than any animal she'd ever known. "Good boy," Owen whispered, running a hand over Scout's head. "You found her. You saved her life." But Detective Brooks was far from saved. Her body temperature was dropping rapidly, and without immediate medical attention, she would die out here in the snow. The nearest hospital was 30 miles away, through mountain roads that were probably impassable by now. Owen looked back toward his truck, where he could see Penny's frightened face pressed against the back window watching. He had to make an impossible choice: stay with the dying police officer and risk his daughter's safety, or leave the woman and prioritize his own family's survival. It was Scout who made the decision for him. The dog suddenly lifted his head, ears perked and alert, listening to something Owen couldn't hear. Then, with a determination that was almost human, Scout began gently gripping Detective Brooks's jacket sleeve in his teeth, trying to drag her toward the truck. "Scout, she's too heavy for you," Owen said, but the dog's message was clear. They weren't leaving her behind. Owen slipped his arms under the unconscious woman's body and lifted her as carefully as possible, trying not to jostle her broken arm. She was lighter than he'd expected. Too light, really, as if she hadn't been eating properly. Her face was even paler up close, and he could see the beginnings of frostbite on her fingertips. The trek back to the truck through the deepening snow was a nightmare. Owen's legs burned with the effort of carrying Detective Brooks while fighting against the wind, and more than once he nearly lost his footing on the hidden ice. Scout stayed close, pressing against Owen's legs to provide stability, the dog's intelligence and loyalty shining through every action. When they finally reached the truck, Penny had managed to get the back door open and was waiting with blankets from their emergency kit. Blankets that Sarah had insisted they keep in the vehicle, just in case. "Is she going to be okay, Daddy?" Penny asked, her voice small and frightened, as Owen carefully laid Detective Brooks across the back seat. "I don't know, sweetheart," Owen admitted, tucking the blankets around the unconscious woman. "But we're going to do everything we can." Scout immediately jumped into the back and resumed his position, pressed against Detective Brooks's side, his warm body becoming a living heating pad. The dog's dark eyes never left the woman's face, as if he were willing her to keep breathing through sheer force of devotion. Owen climbed back into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he started the engine and cranked the heat to maximum. The truck's interior quickly filled with warm air, but Detective Brooks remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and erratic. "Where are we going to take her?" Penny asked. "The hospital is really far." Owen stared out at the storm, his mind racing. The main highway to Kalispell Regional Medical Center would be impossible to navigate in these conditions, especially with an unconscious passenger who needed immediate care. But there was another option. Dr. Margaret Wells, the retired military medic, who lived just 8 miles away in the tiny town of Clearwater Falls. She might not have a full hospital at her disposal, but she had decades of battlefield experience and might be their only hope. "We're going to take her to Dr. Wells," Owen decided, putting the truck in gear. "She'll know what to do." As they pulled back onto the highway, Owen caught sight of something in his rearview mirror that made his blood run cold. Through the swirling snow barely visible in the distance, a pair of headlights had appeared on the road behind them. They were moving slowly, deliberately, as if searching for something or someone. Owen pressed harder on the accelerator, the truck's engine roaring as they picked up speed. In the back seat, Detective Brooks stirred slightly, her lips moving in what might have been words or might have been pain. Scout's ears were perked again, his body tense with the same alertness he'd shown before finding the crashed cruiser. "Daddy, someone's following us," Penny said, having noticed the lights behind them too. "I see them," Owen replied, his voice carefully controlled. He didn't want to frighten his daughter, but every instinct he possessed was screaming that they were in danger. Detective Brooks had tried to say something about they, someone who had tried to hurt her. What if those headlights belonged to the same people? The lights behind them were gaining ground, moving faster than should have been safe on these treacherous roads. Owen pushed the truck harder, the speedometer creeping past 45 miles per hour, which felt like flying in these conditions. The steering wheel shook in his hands as the tires fought for traction on the ice-covered asphalt. Scout suddenly let out a low growl, his hackles rising as he stared out the back window. The dog had never growled at headlights before. But then again, Scout had been acting strangely all evening, as if he could sense threats that Owen couldn't perceive. Detective Brooks's eyes fluttered open again, and this time they were more focused, filled with a desperate urgency that made Owen's heart race. "No," she whispered, trying to sit up despite her injuries. Can't let them." "It's okay," Owen said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "You're safe now. We're taking you to get help." But Detective Brooks was shaking her head weakly, her good hand clutching at the blankets. "Not safe. Nowhere safe. They killed him. They killed Tommy." The headlights behind them were getting closer, close enough now that Owen could make out the outline of a large SUV with what looked like light bars mounted on the roof. Not a typical civilian vehicle. This looked official, like law enforcement or emergency services. But if they were the good guys, why was Detective Brooks so terrified? "Who killed Tommy?" Owen asked, dividing his attention between the road ahead and the mirror. "Who's chasing us?" "Henderson." She breathed the name, carried on a breath so quiet, Owen almost missed it. "Sheriff Henderson. Can't trust anyone." The pieces clicked together in Owen's mind with sickening clarity. Detective Brooks wasn't just injured. She was running from her own department. And if Sheriff Henderson was involved, then the SUV behind them wasn't coming to help. They were being hunted. Owen made a split-second decision that would change all their lives forever. Instead of continuing toward Dr. Wells's house on the main road, he yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, taking an almost invisible logging road that disappeared into the dense forest. The truck's tires slipped and skidded on the sudden turn, but held, carrying them into the shelter of the towering pines. "Daddy, what are you doing?" Penny cried as branches scraped against the windows. "Taking a shortcut." Owen lied, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The SUV's headlights swept past the logging road entrance, continuing down the main highway. Had they missed the turn, or were they playing a more sophisticated game? The logging road was barely more than 2 parallel ruts in the snow, winding deeper into the wilderness with each passing mile. Owen's truck bounced and lurched over hidden rocks and fallen branches, the suspension groaning under the strain. In the back seat, Detective Brooks was fighting to stay conscious, her eyes darting between Owen and the windows as if expecting attackers to emerge from the forest at any moment. Scout remained pressed against her side, his warm presence providing comfort that no amount of blankets could match. The dog's breathing had synchronized with hers, as if he were somehow sharing his life force to keep her alive. "Where does this road go?" Penny asked, her voice tight with fear she was trying hard to hide. "To the old mining camp," Owen replied, remembering childhood adventures with his father in these same mountains. "There's a cabin there. It's not much, but it's shelter." What he didn't tell his daughter was that the mining camp had been abandoned for over 20 years, and he wasn't even sure the cabin was still standing. But it was their best hope, a place where they could tend to Detective Brooks's injuries and figure out what the hell was happening. Behind them, the forest was dark and silent, the storm muffling all sound except the labored breathing of their passenger and Scout's protective presence. But Owen couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched, still being hunted by forces he didn't understand. Detective Brooks's hand suddenly gripped his shoulder with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his coat. "The dog," she whispered urgently. "The dog saved my life. But they're going to kill him too. Kill all of you. If you don't get away from me." "Nobody's going to hurt Scout," Owen said firmly. "Or Penny, or you, I promise." It was a promise he had no idea how to keep, but as he looked at his daughter's frightened face and felt Scout's unwavering loyalty radiating from the back seat, Owen Carter knew he would die before he let anything happen to his makeshift family. The truck's headlights swept across a weathered wooden sign hanging from a rusted chain. Clearwater Mining Company, established 1952. They had reached the abandoned camp, a collection of dilapidated buildings huddled against the mountainside like sleeping giants. As Owen parked the truck beside what had once been the main office, Detective Brooks struggled to sit up, her eyes more alert than they'd been since he found her. "They think I'm dead," she said, her voice growing stronger despite her injuries. "But I know what they did. I know about the murders, the cover-ups, everything." Scout whined softly and licked her hand as if encouraging her to continue. "That's why you ran," Owen said, understanding flooding through him. "You discovered something you weren't supposed to know." Detective Brooks nodded weakly, wincing as the movement aggravated her head injury. "Tommy Martinez, he was my partner. We were investigating the disappearance of 3 women over the past 2 years. Young women, all with dark hair, all last seen near the highway." Owen felt ice form in his veins. 3 missing women, and now a female detective on the run from her own sheriff's department. The implications were staggering. "We found evidence," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Photos, documents, proof that Henderson and at least 2 other deputies were involved. But when Tommy tried to contact the state police," she didn't need to finish. Owen could see the pain in her eyes, the grief and rage that burned there like a flame. "They killed him," Owen said softly. "Made it look like a hunting accident," she confirmed. "But I saw the meeting. I heard them planning to get rid of the evidence. To get rid of me." Scout suddenly raised his head, ears perked and alert. A moment later, Owen heard it too, the distant sound of engines, multiple vehicles approaching through the forest. They had been found. Detective Brooks struggled to sit up straighter, her good hand moving instinctively toward where her service weapon should have been. But her holster was empty, probably lost in the crash or taken by her attackers. "We have to run," she said urgently. "They can't find the evidence I hid. If they get their hands on it, those women will never get justice." Owen looked at his daughter, at Scout, at the injured woman who had stumbled into their lives and turned everything upside down. 2 hours ago, his biggest worry had been getting Penny safely to her grandmother's house. Now they were fugitives running from corrupt law enforcement through a blizzard with a federal case's worth of evidence hidden somewhere in the wilderness. The sound of engines was getting closer, and through the storm, Owen could see the first flicker of headlights cutting through the trees. "Where's the evidence?" he asked. Detective Brooks smiled grimly, reaching into her jacket pocket to pull out a small waterproof container. "Right here. Photos, audio recordings, bank account numbers. Everything needed to bring down Henderson and his crew." Scout barked once, sharp and urgent, his eyes fixed on the approaching lights. The dog's message was clear: time to go. Owen made another split-second decision that would define the rest of their lives. He grabbed the container from Detective Brooks, stuffing it deep into his own pocket. "Then we run," he said simply. "All of us. Together." As the first SUV broke through the tree line, its spotlight sweeping across the abandoned mining camp, Owen Carter helped Detective Rachel Brooks out of the truck and into the storm with Scout leading the way, and Penny's small hand clasped tightly in his own. They disappeared into the wilderness just as the first shots rang out behind them, the sound echoing through the mountains like thunder. The hunt had begun in earnest, but Owen Carter was no longer just a single father trying to keep his family safe. He was a man with evidence that could bring down a conspiracy, a woman whose courage had already cost her everything, a daughter whose innocence was being stripped away by the harsh realities of the world, and a golden retriever whose loyalty would prove to be their greatest asset. Behind them, the abandoned mining camp erupted in chaos, as armed figures in tactical gear swarmed through the buildings, searching for evidence that was no longer there. Sheriff Henderson's voice could be heard above the wind, shouting orders with the desperation of a man whose carefully constructed world was falling apart. But Owen and his unlikely family were already gone, swallowed by the storm and the endless Montana wilderness, carrying with them the key to justice and the hope that sometimes, against all odds, the good guys really can win. The forest swallowed them whole, ancient pines, standing like sentinels against the storm, as Owen led his unlikely family deeper into the wilderness. Snow crunched beneath their feet, each step a small avalanche that threatened to give away their position to the hunters behind them. Detective Brooks leaned heavily against Owen's shoulder, her broken arm cradled against her chest, but her eyes remained sharp and alert, despite the pain that must have been coursing through her body. Scout padded silently ahead, his golden coat dusted with snow, pausing every few yards to ensure they were still following. The dog's instincts were proving invaluable. More than once, he'd steered them away from areas where the snow was too deep or the terrain too treacherous for their injured companion. "Daddy, I'm scared," Penny whispered, her small voice barely audible above the howling wind. Owen squeezed his daughter's hand reassuringly. "I know, sweetheart, but we're going to be okay. Scout's taking good care of us." Behind them, the lights from the mining camp grew fainter with each step, but Owen could still hear the distant sound of voices shouting orders through the storm. Henderson's men were organizing a search pattern, and it was only a matter of time before they picked up their trail. Detective Brooks stumbled, nearly falling face first into the snow before Owen caught her around the waist. "I'm slowing you down," she gasped, her breath coming in ragged puffs. "You should leave me here and take Penny somewhere safe." "Not happening," Owen replied firmly. "We stick together." "You don't understand." She pressed her voice, taking on an urgent intensity. "These aren't just corrupt cops we're dealing with. Henderson has connections that go all the way up the chain. State level, maybe even federal. He's been covering up these murders for years, and he'll kill anyone who threatens to expose him." Scout suddenly stopped ahead of them, his head cocked to one side as if listening to something they couldn't hear. Then, with purposeful determination, He veered left toward what appeared to be a sheer rock face. As they got closer, Owen realized it wasn't solid stone. There was a narrow gap between two massive boulders, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "Good boy," Owen breathed, recognizing the entrance to one of the many caves that honeycombed these mountains. His father had shown him some of them during hunting trips when he was Penny's age, natural shelters formed by centuries of wind and water erosion. The cave was larger inside than it appeared from the entrance, extending back into the mountain, far enough that their flashlight beam couldn't reach the rear wall. More importantly, it was dry and significantly warmer than the storm outside, offering them a temporary respite from the brutal conditions. Owen helped Detective Brooks settle against the cave wall, using his jacket to cushion her back against the rough stone. Scout immediately curled up beside her, sharing his body heat, while keeping one ear tuned to the entrance for any sign of pursuit. "What's your first name?" Owen asked as he checked the detective's injuries by flashlight. "I can't keep thinking of you as Detective Brooks." "Rachel," she replied, wincing, as he examined the cut on her forehead. "Rachel Marie Brooks, though my friends call me Ray." "Ray it is," Owen said, using his shirt sleeve to clean the dried blood from her wound. "I'm Owen Carter. This is my daughter Penny, and our hero here is Scout." Penny had been unusually quiet since they'd left the truck, but now she spoke up from where she sat near the cave entrance, keeping watch. "Ray, why did those bad men hurt you?" Rachel's face softened as she looked at the 8-year-old girl. "Sometimes when people do wrong things, they try to hurt anyone who might tell on them. That's what happened to me and my partner Tommy." "What kind of wrong things?" Penny pressed her natural curiosity, overcoming her fear. Rachel glanced at Owen, who nodded slightly. His daughter had already seen too much tonight. She deserved to understand what they were running from. 3 young women disappeared over the past 2 years, Rachel explained gently. They were all around the same age, all had dark hair like yours, Penny. Tommy and I were trying to find out what happened to them." "And you think Sheriff Henderson was involved?" Owen asked. Rachel reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, its red light blinking to indicate it was still functioning, despite everything she'd been through. "I don't think... I know. This contains a recording of Henderson and 2 of his deputies discussing how to dispose of evidence. They mentioned burial sites payoffs to keep witnesses quiet, even plans to frame someone else for the crimes." The sound of distant voices echoed off the mountain walls, still far away but getting closer. Scout's ears perked up and he let out a low growl that barely qualified as sound. "They're following our tracks in the snow." Owen realized his heart sinking. "Even in this storm, they'll be able to trace us here eventually." "Then we keep moving," Rachel said, struggling to stand despite her injuries. "I know these mountains. There's an old ranger station about 2 miles northeast of here. It's been abandoned for years, but it might have supplies we can use." Owen helped her to her feet, noting how pale she'd become. She was pushing herself beyond her physical limits, driven by determination and the knowledge that stopping meant death for all of them. "Can you make it 2 more miles?" he asked quietly. "I have to," she replied simply. "Those women deserve justice and you and Penny deserve to live. That's all the motivation I need." They left the cave reluctantly, stepping back into the storm that seemed to have intensified during their brief rest. The wind was fierce enough to knock Penny off her feet, forcing Owen to carry her while still supporting Rachel. Scout ranged ahead, his thick coat providing protection against the elements as he searched for the safest path through the treacherous terrain. The voices behind them were definitely getting closer now, accompanied by the beams of high-powered flashlights that swept back and forth across the forest floor. Henderson's men were experienced hunters and trackers. It was only the severity of the storm that had prevented them from closing the gap already. "Owen," Rachel gasped as they navigated around a fallen tree that blocked their path. If something happens to me, you have to promise you'll get that evidence to someone who can use it. There's a federal agent named Sarah Chen in Billings. She's been investigating corruption in rural sheriff's departments. She's the only one I trust. Nothing's going to happen to you, Owen replied, though he wasn't sure he believed his own words. Rachel was deteriorating rapidly, her breathing becoming more labored with each step. Penny looked back at the pursuing lights with wide, frightened eyes. "Daddy, what if they catch us?" Before Owen could answer, Scout suddenly barked. Not his usual warning bark, but something different. Excited, happy even. The dog had stopped near a cluster of pine trees that looked identical to hundreds of others they'd passed. But as they approached, Owen realized what Scout had found. Hidden among the trees was a small log cabin so weathered and overgrown that it was nearly invisible until you were right on top of it. This wasn't the ranger station Rachel had mentioned. This was something else entirely. Something older and more isolated. "I know this place." Rachel breathed, recognition dawning in her eyes. "This is where Tommy and I found the first piece of evidence. One of Henderson's victims managed to escape and hide here before she died. We found her journal." Owen helped Rachel to the cabin's front door, which hung askew on rusted hinges. Inside the structure was surprisingly intact, with a stone fireplace, basic furniture, and even some canned goods on rough-hewn shelves. Someone had been using this place recently. There were fresh ashes in the fireplace and clean blankets folded on the single bed. "This is perfect," Owen said, settling Rachel on the bed, while Penny explored the small space with Scout close beside her. "We can rest here, tend to your injuries properly, and figure out our next move." But Rachel was shaking her head, her face grim with realization. "You don't understand. If I recognized this place, Henderson will too. He knows about the cabin because we mentioned it in our report. He'll check here first." As if summoned by her words, the sound of vehicles reached them through the storm, multiple engines much closer than before. Through the cabin's single window, Owen could see lights moving between the trees, systematically searching every structure and clearing in the area. "How long do we have?" Owen asked, already gathering supplies from the cabin's shelves. "Minutes, maybe less," Rachel replied, struggling to stand again. "There's a back way out, through the kitchen window. It leads to a ravine that connects to the river system." Scout was already at the kitchen window, his nose pressed against the glass, as he assessed their escape route. The dog seemed to understand the urgency of their situation, his intelligent eyes moving between the approaching lights and the window with calculated precision. Owen boosted Penny through the window first, then helped Rachel climb out, despite her protests of pain. Scout leaped through with fluid grace, immediately positioning himself to help guide Rachel across the uneven ground behind the cabin. They had barely made it 50 yards when the front door of the cabin exploded inward, kicked off its hinges by a heavy boot. Flashlight beams swept across the interior, followed by harsh voices shouting commands. "They were here," someone called out. Not Henderson's voice, but one of his deputies. "The bed's still warm and there's blood on the blankets." "Find them," came Henderson's unmistakable growl from inside the cabin. "They can't have gone far in this storm." Owen pressed his family flat against the snowy ground behind a fallen log, praying that the storm would mask their heat signatures from any thermal imaging equipment the hunters might be using. Rachel was shivering violently beside him, her body struggling to maintain core temperature as shock and blood loss took their toll. Scout crawled forward on his belly until he was positioned between the family and the cabin. His golden coat blending surprisingly well with the dried grass that poked through the snow. The dog's body was tense, ready to spring into action if their pursuers came too close. "There!" shouted another voice. "Tracks leading toward the ravine." The beam of a powerful spotlight swept across the area where they were hiding, passing so close to Owen's head that he could feel the heat from the bulb. But Scout's positioning had been perfect. The dog's body blocked the light from reaching the rest of the family, creating a shadow that concealed them in plain sight. "I don't see anything," the deputy with the spotlight called back. "Just animal tracks!" Henderson's voice carried clearly through the storm filled with frustrated rage. "They're out there somewhere. Split up and search every ravine, every cave, every tree that's big enough to hide behind. I want them found before dawn." The search party dispersed their lights, moving in different directions, as they began a systematic sweep of the area. But Owen knew it was only a matter of time before someone spotted their tracks, or Scout's golden coat gave away their position. "The river," Rachel whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. "If we can reach the river, we can follow it downstream to the old logging bridge. From there, it's only 3 miles to Highway 2. Owen helped her to her feet, noting how she swayed unsteadily despite his support. "Can you swim if we have to?" "In this weather, none of us could survive more than a few minutes in that water," she replied honestly. "But there are places where the river runs shallow, especially this time of year, when it's partially frozen." They began moving again, Scout leading them down the steep slope toward the sound of rushing water. The ravine was treacherous in the darkness, filled with loose rocks and hidden drop-offs that could easily result in a broken ankle or worse. But the dog's instincts were flawless, guiding them along a path that seemed to have been designed specifically for their escape. The river was wider than Owen had expected, its dark water moving swiftly, despite the ice that formed along its banks. In the moonlight that occasionally broke through the storm clouds, he could see that Rachel was right. There were several places where the water looked shallow enough to wade across. "There," Rachel pointed with her good arm toward a section where large boulders created a natural ford. "We can cross there without getting swept downstream." But as they approached the water's edge, Scout suddenly froze, his hackles rising as he stared across the river. On the opposite bank, barely visible through the swirling snow, 2 figures in tactical gear were moving along the water's edge with military precision. "They're flanking us," Owen realized with growing dread. Henderson split his forces, some to track us from behind, others to cut off our escape routes. Rachel pulled the small digital recorder from her jacket and pressed it into Owen's hands. "Take this and go. Wade downstream to the logging bridge, then follow Highway 2 to the truck stop at mile marker 47. There's a payphone there. Call Agent Chen in Billings and tell her what happened." "I'm not leaving you," Owen said firmly. "You have to," she insisted, her eyes fierce despite her weakening condition. "That recording is the only chance those murdered women have for justice. It's more important than my life." Penny suddenly spoke up from where she'd been watching the tactical team across the river. "Why don't we go upstream instead? If they're watching downstream, maybe they won't expect us to go the other way." Owen looked at his 8-year-old daughter with newfound respect. "That's actually brilliant." Rachel smiled weakly. "Smart kid. But upstream leads deeper into the wilderness. We'd be trading immediate capture for eventual death by exposure." "Not necessarily," Owen said, remembering his father's stories about the old mining operations in these mountains. "There are abandoned mining shafts up there, some with access tunnels that run for miles. If we could find one, we could use it to get past Henderson's search perimeter." Scout seemed to approve of this plan, already moving upstream along the riverbank with purposeful determination. The dog had proven his worth as a guide multiple times tonight. Owen was beginning to trust Scout's instincts more than his own. They followed the river for nearly a mile, staying close to the bank, where the sound of rushing water would mask their footsteps. Rachel was leaning more heavily on Owen, with each step her face gray with pain and exhaustion, but she never complained or asked to rest. The abandoned mine entrance appeared suddenly a black hole in the mountainside framed by rotting timber supports and rusted warning signs. Scout paused at the threshold, sniffing the air flowing from the tunnel, before stepping inside to confirm it was safe. "I can't believe we found it," Owen breathed, helping Rachel sit on a boulder near the entrance. These tunnels were part of the Clearwater Mining Company's operation. They connect to at least 3 different exit points. "How do you know so much about them?" Rachel asked. "My father worked here when I was young before the company went bankrupt," Owen explained. "He used to bring me up here on weekends, showed me how the whole system connected." Penny wrinkled her nose as they entered the tunnel. "It smells funny in here." "That's just the old mining equipment," Owen assured her, though he privately shared her concern. The air in the tunnel was stale and carried a metallic odor that spoke of decades of abandonment. They had walked perhaps a quarter mile into the tunnel when Scout suddenly stopped, his body going rigid with alertness. Behind them, echoing from the entrance, came the sound of voices and footsteps. "The tracks lead right to the mine entrance," someone called out. "They're definitely down there." Henderson's voice boomed through the tunnel, distorted by the rocky walls but still unmistakably filled with rage. "Good. They've trapped themselves. Send half the team around to the other exits. I'll take point down here." Owen felt his heart sink as he realized their mistake. The mining tunnels that had seemed like salvation were actually a death trap. Henderson knew these mountains as well as anyone, and he would certainly know about all the tunnel exits. "There's another way," Rachel whispered urgently, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. "Tommy and I found this map during our investigation. It shows a natural cave system that connects to the mining tunnels about half a mile deeper in." Owen studied the hand-drawn map by flashlight, noting the complex network of passages that branched off from the main tunnel. "This looks like it was drawn by someone who knew these mountains intimately." "It was," Rachel confirmed. "The woman who died in that cabin. She was a geologist before Henderson and his men abducted her. She spent weeks hiding in these tunnels before she finally succumbed to her injuries." The voices behind them were getting closer, accompanied by the steady beam of tactical flashlights that swept back and forth across the tunnel walls. Scout pressed close to Penny, his warm presence providing comfort as they ventured deeper into the underground maze. "Here," Rachel said, pointing to a narrow side passage that was barely visible unless you knew where to look. "According to the map, this leads to the cave system." The passage was so narrow that they had to move single file, with Scout leading the way and Owen bringing up the rear while supporting Rachel. The walls pressed close on both sides, and more than once Owen had to help his injured companion squeeze through particularly tight spots. Behind them, Henderson's voice echoed with frustrated rage. "Where the hell did they go? There's only one tunnel." "Maybe they doubled back," suggested one of his deputies. "Impossible. We would have seen them. Keep searching. There has to be another passage." The narrow corridor opened abruptly into a vast underground cavern, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above their heads. Stalactites hung like ancient teeth, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the sound of underground water flowing through hidden channels. "My God," Rachel breathed, her voice filled with awe, despite their desperate circumstances. "It's beautiful." Scout was already exploring the cavern's perimeter, his nose working to identify the various scents and sounds that filled the space. Suddenly, he barked once. Not a warning this time, but excitement. He had found something. Following the dog's lead, they discovered that the cavern contained several passages leading in different directions. According to Rachel's map, one of them should connect to a cave system that emerged near Highway 2, miles from where Henderson's men were searching. "That one," Owen said, pointing to a passage that matched the description on the map. "It should take us under the mountain and come out near Glacier Creek." They had been walking through the cave system for what felt like hours, when Penny finally voiced what Owen had been thinking. "Daddy, are we lost?" Owen looked at the map again, trying to match their current location with the crude drawings and notations. The truth was, he wasn't entirely certain where they were, but admitting that would only frighten his daughter more. "We're not lost," he said carefully. "We're just taking a longer route than expected." Rachel stumbled and nearly fell, saved only by Owen's quick reflexes. She was clearly reaching the end of her physical reserves, her face pale and her breathing labored. "I need to rest," she admitted reluctantly. "Just for a few minutes." They found a relatively comfortable spot where the cave widened enough for them to sit down. Scout immediately curled up next to Rachel, sharing his warmth while keeping his senses alert for any sign of danger. "Tell me about your wife," Rachel said quietly, noting the wedding ring that Owen still wore despite Sarah's death 2 years ago. Owen's face softened as he looked at Penny, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder. Sarah was everything. A teacher, an artist, the kind of person who could find beauty in anything. She's the one who trained Scout, actually. Said every family needed a guardian angel, even if it came with 4 legs and a tendency to steal food off the counter. "She sounds wonderful," Rachel said. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Cancer," Owen replied simply. "She fought it for 3 years, never complained, never gave up hope. Even at the end, she was more worried about how Penny and I would manage without her." Scout suddenly raised his head, ears perked and alert. In the distance, echoing through the cave system, came the faint sound of voices. Henderson's search had expanded to include the caves. "They found the passage," Rachel whispered, struggling to stand. "We have to keep moving." The next section of cave was the most challenging, yet requiring them to crawl through passages barely large enough for an adult human. Penny, being the smallest, had the easiest time, while Rachel's injuries made every movement an exercise in pain management. Scout's behavior became increasingly excited as they progressed, his tail wagging, despite the danger behind them. The dog seemed to sense something ahead that filled him with anticipation. Then Owen smelled it too. Fresh air. Real, honest-to-goodness outdoor air flowing through the cave system from somewhere ahead. "We're almost out," he told the others, feeling hope bloom in his chest for the first time since this nightmare began. The cave mouth was hidden behind a curtain of icicles, invisible from outside, but allowing them to see across a snow-covered valley to where Highway 2 ran like a black ribbon through the wilderness. They had done it. They had successfully navigated the underground maze and emerged miles from where Henderson's men were searching. But their relief was short-lived. As they prepared to leave the cave, Rachel collapsed completely, her body finally succumbing to blood loss and exhaustion. "Ray!" Penny cried, dropping to her knees beside the unconscious detective. Owen checked Rachel's pulse, finding it weak and irregular. She needed medical attention immediately, more than he could provide with basic first aid in a cave. Scout whined and pawed at Rachel's hand, as if trying to wake her through sheer force of will. The dog's devotion to their injured companion had never wavered, even though they'd only known each other for a few hours. "Daddy, is she going to die?" Penny asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. Owen looked at his daughter's frightened face, then at Rachel's pale features, then at Scout's intelligent eyes that seemed to be asking the same question. They had come so far, survived so much. He wasn't about to give up now. "No," he said firmly, gathering Rachel in his arms. "She's not going to die. We're going to get her to a hospital, and then we're going to make sure Henderson pays for what he's done." As they emerged from the cave into the pre-dawn darkness, Owen Carter realized that their nightmare was far from over. They still had to reach safety, get medical help for Rachel, and somehow expose Henderson's crimes before he could cover his tracks permanently. But they also had something Henderson didn't expect: the unbreakable bond between a father, his daughter, an injured detective, and a golden retriever whose courage had already saved all their lives. Together they were stronger than the sum of their parts. And sometimes Owen reflected as they made their way toward the distant highway, with Scout leading the way, that's exactly what it takes to change the world. The highway stretched before them like a lifeline, its asphalt surface barely visible through the swirling snow, but representing salvation nonetheless. Owen's arms ached from carrying Rachel's unconscious form, but he pressed forward with Scout padding silently beside him, the dog's golden coat now dusted white with accumulated snow. Penny walked close to her father's side, her small hand gripping his jacket as she fought against the wind that threatened to knock her off her feet. "There," Owen gasped, spotting the faint glow of lights in the distance. "That has to be the truck stop Rachel mentioned." But as they drew closer, Owen's heart sank. The building that had seemed so promising from afar revealed itself to be nothing more than an abandoned gas station, its windows boarded up and its sign hanging at a broken angle. The lights he'd seen were just reflective surfaces catching the occasional break in the storm clouds. Rachel stirred in his arms, her eyes fluttering open with obvious effort. Where are we?" "About 2 miles from where the cave led out," Owen replied gently, adjusting his grip to make her more comfortable. "We found the highway, but the truck stop isn't where you thought it would be." Scout suddenly stopped walking, his ears perked and his body tense with alertness. The dog stared back the way they'd come, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Through the storm, Owen could barely make out the distant glow of headlights moving along the mountain roads they'd just escaped. "Henderson's people," Rachel whispered, her voice weak but filled with urgency. "They must have found our exit point. We need to get off this highway." "There," Penny pointed to their left where a small road branched off from the main highway. "That sign says Clearwater Falls, 3 miles. Owen remembered Clearwater Falls from his childhood. A tiny community of maybe 200 people, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. It wasn't ideal for hiding, but it was their best option, with Rachel growing weaker by the minute. The walk to Clearwater Falls took them nearly an hour, with Owen having to stop frequently to rest his arms and check on Rachel's condition. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling about evidence and federal agents, her fever making her delirious. Scout maintained his vigilant watch, ranging ahead to scout the route and falling back to check on the family with the dedication of a trained guardian. More than once, the dog's warning growls alerted them to approaching vehicles, forcing them to hide in roadside ditches until the danger passed. Clearwater Falls materialized out of the storm like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. A main street lined with modest homes and small businesses, their windows glowing with warm yellow light. Most of the buildings were dark at this early hour, but smoke rising from several chimneys indicated that some residents were already awake. "We need medical help," Owen said, looking around for any sign of a clinic or doctor's office. "And we need someone we can trust." Rachel's eyes opened again, more focused this time. The woman who drew the cave map. In her journal, she mentioned someone in Clearwater Falls who tried to help her. Margaret Wells. She's a retired Army medic. Owen felt a surge of hope. Dr. Wells was exactly who he'd been thinking of taking Rachel to before their flight into the wilderness. "I know her. She lives on Pine Street, the blue house with the white picket fence." And they found the house easily enough, its porch light creating a welcoming beacon in the pre-dawn darkness. Owen hesitated before knocking, knowing that involving Dr. Wells would put another innocent person in danger. But Rachel's deteriorating condition left him no choice. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp blue eyes that immediately assessed the situation with military efficiency. Margaret Wells had seen enough combat casualties to recognize critical injuries when she saw them. "Owen Carter," she said, stepping aside to let them in without question. "I heard about Sarah. I'm sorry for your loss." Her eyes moved to Rachel's unconscious form. "Gunshot wound, head trauma and a broken arm," Owen replied as Dr. Wells directed him to lay Rachel on the couch. "She was in a car accident, but we think someone attacked her first." Dr. Wells began examining Rachel with practiced hands, checking pupils' pulse and breathing. "This woman needs a hospital, Owen. I can stabilize her here, but she's showing signs of a serious concussion and possible internal bleeding." Scout positioned himself near the couch, his watchful eyes never leaving Rachel's face. Penny sat in a nearby chair, exhaustion finally catching up with her as the adrenaline of their escape began to fade. "We can't take her to a hospital," Owen said quietly, pulling Dr. Wells aside. "The people who hurt her, they're law enforcement, Sheriff Henderson and some of his deputies. They're involved in the disappearance of several women, and Rachel has evidence that could expose them." Dr. Wells's expression hardened. "Jim Henderson always struck me as a snake, but murder." She shook her head grimly. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. There have been rumors for years about missing hikers and campers in his jurisdiction." She returned to Rachel's side, her movements becoming more urgent as she noted the patient's declining vital signs. "I need to start an IV, get some fluids into her. And that head wound needs proper cleaning and stitching." While Dr. Wells worked, Owen tried calling the number Rachel had given him for FBI agent Sarah Chen in Billings. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail, leaving Owen frustrated and uncertain about their next move. "No answer," he reported to Rachel, who had regained consciousness during Dr. Wells's examination. "Try again in an hour," Rachel whispered, her voice slightly stronger thanks to the IV fluids. "Chen works early shifts. She'll be in the office by 7. Scout suddenly raised his head from where he'd been resting beside the couch, his ears perked and alert. Through the front window, Owen could see the sweep of headlights as a vehicle moved slowly down Pine Street, its occupants clearly searching for something. "They found us," Owen said, his heart racing as he recognized the outline of Henderson's SUV. Wells moved with surprising speed for someone her age, switching off the front porch light and closing the curtains. "There's a storm cellar out back," she said quietly. "You can hide there until they move on." But Rachel was shaking her head weakly. "They'll search every building in town eventually. We need to keep moving." "In your condition, absolutely not," Dr. Wells replied firmly. "You'll be dead within hours if you don't get proper rest." The SUV had stopped in front of the house, its engine idling, as the occupants conducted surveillance. Owen could see at least 2 figures inside their silhouettes, backlit by the vehicle's interior lights. "There's another option," Dr. Wells said thoughtfully. "My nephew Tommy runs a freight operation out of Kalispell. He's got trucks coming through here around dawn to pick up lumber shipments. If you could get aboard one of his rigs—" "That's too dangerous," Owen protested. "If Henderson's people are watching the roads, they're watching for a man, a woman, a child, and a dog traveling together," Dr. Wells interrupted. "They're not looking for truck cargo." Scout's low growl indicated that someone was approaching the house. Through the gap in the curtains, Owen could see a figure moving up the front walkway. One of Henderson's deputies, his hand resting on his service weapon. The knock on the front door was loud and authoritative. "Dr. Wells Sheriff's Department, we need to ask you some questions." Dr. Wells gestured for Owen and his family to move toward the back of the house while she answered the door. "Just a moment," she called out, buying them precious seconds to reach the kitchen. "Good evening, Deputy Morrison," Owen heard her say as she opened the front door. "What brings you out so early?" "We're looking for some folks who might be in the area," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the false friendliness of someone conducting an interrogation. Man in his 30s, little girl, big dog, and a woman with dark hair. Have you seen anyone matching that description? Can't say that I have, Dr. Wells replied smoothly. I've been up most of the night with Mrs. Patterson's difficult birth over on Elm Street. Is there some kind of problem? Owen held his breath pressed against the kitchen wall with Penny in his arms and Scout standing alert beside them. Rachel had managed to sit up despite Dr. Wells's protests, her hand gripping the digital recorder that contained evidence of Henderson's crimes. There was an incident up in the mountains, Morrison continued. We have reason to believe these individuals might be dangerous. If you see them, don't approach. Just call the sheriff's office immediately. Of course, Dr. Wells agreed. I'll keep an eye out. After Morrison left, Dr. Wells returned to the kitchen where Owen and his family waited in tense silence. That settles it, she said firmly. You're taking Tommy's truck. It's your best chance of getting out of here alive. She made a quick phone call, speaking in hushed tones to her nephew about an emergency shipment that needed to get to Billings immediately. Within minutes, she'd arranged for them to hide in the cargo area of a lumber truck that would be passing through town just after sunrise. What about you? Owen asked, concerned about leaving the elderly doctor to face Henderson's wrath if their presence was discovered. I can handle Jim Henderson and his cronies, Dr. Wells replied with a steely smile. I've been dealing with bullies since before you were born. She spent the remaining time before dawn, ensuring that Rachel was as stable as possible for the journey ahead, adjusting her IV, and providing Owen with supplies to continue her care during the trip to Billings. This recorder, Rachel said, pressing the device into Owen's hands with shaking fingers. If something happens to me, make sure Agent Chen gets it. The access code is Tommy's badge number. He told me it was 22847. Scout seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, pressing close to Rachel and licking her hand gently. The bond that had formed between the dog and the injured detective during their harrowing escape had deepened into something profound, a connection that transcended species and circumstance. The rumble of a heavy diesel engine announced the arrival of Tommy Wells's lumber truck, just as the first pale light of dawn began to penetrate the storm clouds. The vehicle was massive, its cargo area filled with stacks of cut timber secured by heavy chains and tarps. Tommy Wells proved to be a younger version of his aunt, compact, efficient, and unafraid of authority figures who might question his actions. Aunt Maggie says you folks need a ride to Billings, he said simply. No questions asked. He'd prepared a hidden space among the lumber stacks, complete with blankets and a thermos of hot coffee. It wasn't comfortable, but it would keep them concealed during the 3-hour journey to the federal building in Billings. I can't thank you enough, Owen said, as he helped Rachel into their makeshift hiding place. Thank me by staying alive and putting Henderson behind bars. Dr. Wells replied, her expression grim. That man has been a cancer on this community for too long. Scout jumped into the cargo area with practiced ease, immediately positioning himself to provide warmth and comfort to Rachel during the journey. Penny climbed up next, and her small hands gripping the rough wood as she settled into their confined space. As the truck pulled away from Dr. Wells's house, Owen caught a glimpse of Henderson's SUV parked at the end of Pine Street, its occupants maintaining surveillance on the neighborhood. But Tommy's truck was just another commercial vehicle making an early morning delivery, nothing that would attract the attention of corrupt law enforcement officials. The journey to Billings passed in a series of starts and stops, with the truck making scheduled deliveries along the route to maintain the appearance of normal business operations. During one particularly long stop, Rachel's condition took a turn for the worse, her breathing becoming shallow and her skin taking on a grayish pallor that frightened Owen. Hold on, Ray, he whispered, adjusting the blankets around her as Scout pressed closer to share his body heat. We're almost there. Through gaps in the tarp covering their hiding space, Owen could see the outskirts of Billings approaching, strip malls and fast food restaurants that represented civilization and safety. But he also knew that Henderson's influence might extend this far, that corrupt law enforcement networks often had connections across state lines. Tommy's voice came through the cargo area via a small speaker he'd installed. We're approaching the federal building. I'm going to park in the loading dock. You'll have about 5 minutes before security gets curious about why I'm lingering. The truck came to a stop, and Owen heard Tommy engaging in casual conversation with a security guard about delivery schedules and paperwork. It was the perfect cover for their escape from the cargo area. Ready? Owen asked Rachel, who had managed to maintain consciousness through sheer force of will. She nodded weakly, clutching the digital recorder. Agent Chen's office is on the 4th floor. If she's not there, ask for Deputy Director Williams. He's Chen's supervisor and the only other person I trust in the bureau. Scout jumped down from the truck, first scanning the loading dock area for threats, before signaling that it was safe for the others to follow. Owen helped Rachel down, noting how she swayed on her feet despite his support. The federal building was imposing in the way government structures were meant to be, all concrete and glass designed to project authority and permanence. But to Owen, it represented hope for the first time since their nightmare had begun. The security checkpoint inside the lobby presented their first real challenge. Owen realized they looked like refugees, dirty, exhausted, and carrying no identifications except for Rachel's damaged police badge. The federal agents manning the metal detectors eyed them with professional suspicion. We need to see FBI agent Sarah Chen immediately, Rachel said, trying to project authority despite her obvious injuries. I'm Detective Rachel Brooks, Montana State Police, and I have evidence of federal crimes. The lead security agent examined Rachel's badge, noting the damage from her ordeal in the mountains. Ma'am, you're going to need to be more specific about the nature of these alleged crimes. Before Rachel could answer, a clear, authoritative voice cut through the lobby noise. Detective Brooks, I've been expecting your call. Owen turned to see an Asian American woman in her 40s approaching them with purposeful strides. Agent Sarah Chen was exactly what Owen had hoped she would be, professional, competent, and carrying herself with the confidence of someone who'd earned her position through skill rather than politics. Agent Chen, Rachel said, relief evident in her voice. Thank God you're here. Chen's sharp eyes took in Rachel's injuries, Owen's protective stance, Penny's frightened expression, and Scout's alert posture. Let's get you upstairs immediately. Medical team to the 4th floor, she spoke into her radio. Priority 1. The elevator ride to Chen's office felt like an eternity, but once they were behind closed doors, Rachel wasted no time in explaining their situation. She handed over the digital recorder with trembling fingers, her voice growing stronger as she detailed Henderson's crimes and the evidence she and Tommy Martinez had gathered. 3 women, all between the ages of 22 and 28, Rachel said, as Chen loaded the audio files onto her computer. Jessica Winters, Maria Santos, and Carla Thompson. Henderson and at least 2 of his deputies were involved in their abductions and murders. Chen's expression grew grimmer as she listened to the recordings, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she cross-referenced the information with existing federal databases. These voice patterns match recordings we have from other investigations, she said. Henderson has been on our radar for possible corruption, but we never had enough evidence to move forward. Scout had positioned himself near Rachel's chair, his presence providing comfort, as federal medics examined her injuries and started a fresh IV. The dog's loyalty had never wavered during their ordeal, and Owen could see that Rachel drew strength from the animal's unwavering devotion. There's more, Rachel continued, pulling additional items from her jacket pockets. Bank account numbers, photographs of the burial sites, even communications between Henderson and someone he calls the Senator. Chen's eyes widened as she examined the photographs. Detective Brooks, do you realize what you've uncovered here? This isn't just a local corruption case. This appears to be part of a much larger criminal network. Through Chen's office window, Owen could see buildings stretching out below them, a city going about its normal business, while unaware of the drama playing out in the federal building. But he also noticed something that made his blood run cold. A familiar SUV parked across the street, its occupants maintaining surveillance on the building's entrances. Agent Chen, Owen said quietly, pointing toward the window. Henderson's people found us. Chen followed his gaze and immediately reached for her radio. Security, this is Agent Chen Min. I need a team to investigate a suspicious vehicle parked on North 27th Street. Possible surveillance of federal property. But even as she spoke, the SUV was pulling away, its occupants having accomplished their mission of confirming that Owen and Rachel had reached federal authorities. The real question was what Henderson would do with that information. He's going to run, Rachel said, her voice filled with urgency despite her weakening condition. Henderson knows we're here, which means he'll start destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses. We have maybe hours before he disappears completely. Chen was already coordinating with other federal agencies, her phone calls setting in motion a complex operation to apprehend Henderson and his accomplices before they could flee or destroy crucial evidence. But Owen could see the doubt in her eyes, the knowledge that corrupt law enforcement officials had resources and connections that made them formidable opponents. What about us? Owen asked, thinking of Penny's safety above all else. Henderson won't give up just because we've reached the FBI. Witness protection, Chen replied immediately. We'll get you and your daughter to a safe house while we build the case against Henderson. Detective Brooks will need to remain in federal custody for her own protection and for continued medical treatment. But Rachel was shaking her head weakly. Not yet. There's something else. Something I haven't told you about the senator that Henderson mentioned in the recordings. She struggled to sit up straighter, her eyes burning with determination. Last month, Tommy and I intercepted communications between Henderson and someone in Washington. They were discussing a cover-up that goes all the way to the cabinet level. Something about federal land deals and murdered environmental activists. Chen's face paled. Are you saying this corruption extends to federal officials? I'm saying that putting us in witness protection might not be enough, Rachel replied. If Henderson's connections reach that high, nowhere will be safe until we expose the entire network. Owen felt the weight of the digital recorder in his pocket, understanding for the first time the true magnitude of what they'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about 3 murdered women in rural Montana. This was about a conspiracy that could reach the highest levels of government. Scout suddenly alerted again, his ears perked and his body tense. Through Chen's office door, Owen could hear the sound of multiple footsteps in the hallway, moving with military precision that didn't match the normal rhythm of federal building activity. That's not security, Chen said grimly, her hand moving instinctively toward her service weapon. Lock down the floor, she spoke into her radio. Possible hostile intrusion. But the response that came back chilled Owen to the bone. Agent Chen, this is Director Matthews. Stand down and prepare to surrender the subjects in your custody. That's a direct order. Chen stared at her radio in disbelief. Sir, these individuals are federal witnesses with evidence of multiple homicides. Agent Chen. Matthews' voice cut through her protests. You have 60 seconds to comply, or you'll be relieved of duty and charged with obstruction of justice. Owen watched the color drain from Chen's face as she realized the truth. Henderson's corruption had infected the federal building itself. The very people they'd turned to for protection were compromised. "The back stairs," Chen said quietly, moving toward her office safe and removing several items including extra ammunition and what appeared to be classified files. "There's a service elevator that leads to the parking garage. My personal vehicle is parked on sub-level 2. "You can't do this," Owen protested. "You'll be throwing away your career." "My career doesn't matter if innocent people die because I followed corrupt orders," Chen replied firmly. "Besides, Detective Brooks is right. This conspiracy goes much deeper than we initially thought." The sound of footsteps in the hallway was getting closer, accompanied by the distinctive electronic beeping of security cards being used to override locked doors. Whoever was coming for them had high-level access and official authorization. Scout seemed to understand the urgency of their situation, moving toward the office door and taking up a protective stance that would allow him to intercept anyone who tried to enter. The dog's transformation from family pet to guardian was complete. He would defend his pack with his life if necessary. "They're at the end of the hall," Chen whispered, listening to the approaching footsteps. "When I open this door, run straight to the stairwell and don't look back. I'll be right behind you." Owen scooped Penny into his arms while helping Rachel to her feet, noting how she swayed despite her determination to keep moving. The injured detective had pushed herself far beyond her physical limits, sustained only by her commitment to seeing justice done. "Agent Chen," Director Matthews' voice came from just outside the office door. "Last chance to comply peacefully." Chen looked at Owen, Rachel, and Penny with an expression that mixed apology with fierce determination. "Whatever happens next, remember that not everyone in law enforcement is corrupt. There are still people willing to fight for what's right." She yanked open the office door and immediately fired 2 shots down the hallway, not to kill, but to create chaos and confusion. "Go!" she shouted, pushing Owen and his family toward the back stairs. The stairwell erupted in noise as federal agents responded to the gunfire, their shouts and running footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. But Chen's distraction had worked. They reached the service elevator without encountering resistance. "Sub-level 2, Chen gasped as the elevator descended. "Black sedan license plate Alpha Charlie 779. Rachel's condition was deteriorating rapidly, the stress and physical exertion taking a terrible toll on her already fragile state. Scout pressed close to her, his warm presence providing what comfort he could as they descended into the bowels of the federal building. The parking garage was dimly lit and filled with the echoing sounds of car engines and slamming doors from the floors above. Chen's sedan was exactly where she'd said it would be, a nondescript government vehicle that wouldn't attract attention on the street. "Get in," Chen commanded, helping Owen load Rachel into the back seat, while Penny and Scout climbed in beside her. "We're going to drive straight out of here and hope that whoever's running this operation hasn't thought to block the exits yet." As they drove up the parking garage ramp toward street level, Owen could see armed figures moving through the building's lobby, their tactical gear and weapons indicating that this wasn't a standard arrest operation. These were people who were prepared to use lethal force to prevent the truth from coming to light. "Where are we going?" Owen asked, as Chen navigated through Billings traffic with practiced efficiency. "Somewhere Henderson and his federal allies won't think to look," she replied grimly. "I have contacts in the media who specialize in exposing government corruption. If we can get this evidence to them." But her words were cut short as a black SUV pulled alongside their sedan, its passenger window rolling down to reveal the barrel of an automatic weapon. The vehicle's occupants weren't law enforcement. They were private contractors, the kind of mercenaries that government agencies sometimes used for operations that needed to remain off the books. Scout's warning bark was the only thing that saved their lives. The dog's alert gave Chen the split second she needed to slam on the brakes, causing the gunfire to miss their vehicle and shatter the windshield of a car behind them. "Hold on!" Chen shouted, yanking the steering wheel hard to the right and sending their sedan careening across 3 lanes of traffic toward an off-ramp that led to the industrial district. In the back seat, Rachel had lost consciousness again, her breathing shallow and irregular. But even unconscious, her hand still gripped the backup copy of evidence she'd hidden in her jacket. Insurance against exactly this kind of situation. Owen realized with growing dread that their escape from the wilderness had only been the beginning. Now they were facing enemies with federal resources, unlimited budgets, and the willingness to kill anyone who threatened their conspiracy. But they also had something their enemies didn't expect: the unbreakable bonds forged in the Montana wilderness between a father, his daughter, an injured detective, and a golden retriever whose courage had already saved them once. As Agent Chen's sedan raced through the streets of Billings with armed mercenaries in pursuit, Owen Carter understood that the real fight was just beginning. The industrial district of Billings stretched before them, like a concrete maze, its warehouses and factories offering potential sanctuary or deadly traps, depending on how cleverly they could navigate the pursuit closing in behind them. Chen's sedan wove between massive 18-wheelers and delivery trucks, the agent's driving skills honed by years of federal training, as she fought to put distance between them and the black SUVs that seemed to multiply with each passing block. "They're coordinating through radio." Chen observed her eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. "Professional military contractors, not local thugs. Henderson's employers have serious resources." In the back seat, Rachel's breathing had become even more labored, her face gray with the pallor of someone losing the battle against blood loss and trauma. Scout pressed closer to her, his warm body providing what comfort he could, while his intelligent eyes remained alert for new threats. Penny sat rigid with fear, her small hand clutching her father's arm, as bullets shattered the rear window of a truck they'd just passed. "Daddy, are we going to die?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of engines and squealing tires. Owen reached over to squeeze his daughter's hand, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "No, sweetheart. Agent Chen knows what she's doing, and Scout's going to keep us safe." But even as he spoke the words, Owen could see that their situation was deteriorating rapidly. The pursuing vehicles had split up, flanking them from multiple directions with the precision of a military operation. These weren't desperate criminals fleeing justice. They were professionals executing a carefully planned elimination of witnesses. "There," Chen pointed toward a sprawling industrial complex ahead of them, its multiple buildings and loading docks offering the kind of terrain where superior numbers might not guarantee victory. "Rimrock Steel. It's been closed for 6 months, but the security systems are still active." She yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending their sedan skidding through the complex's main gate, just as automatic weapon fire erupted from the pursuing SUVs. Sparks flew from the metal fence posts as bullets ricocheted off steel and concrete, the sound deafening in the enclosed space of their vehicle. The steel plant was a monument to America's industrial past. Massive buildings filled with dormant machinery, overhead cranes frozen in place like sleeping giants, and endless corridors that could hide an army or become a tomb for the unwary. Chen drove deeper into the complex, her headlights cutting through the gloom as she searched for a defensible position. The main smelting building, she decided, steering toward the largest structure in the complex. Multiple floors, limited access points, and enough steel framework to stop armor-piercing rounds. They abandoned the sedan at the building's loading dock, Chen helping Owen carry Rachel, while Scout and Penny stayed close behind. The detective was barely conscious now, her head lolling against Owen's shoulder as he struggled to support her weight, while climbing the metal stairs that led into the building's interior. The smelting floor was a cathedral of industrial architecture, its ceiling disappearing into shadows 40 feet above their heads. Massive furnaces sat cold and silent, their mouths dark and empty, while overhead conveyor systems created a maze of potential hiding places and escape routes. Up there, Chen pointed to a control booth elevated 20 feet above the main floor, its reinforced windows providing clear sight lines in all directions. If we can reach that position, we'll have the tactical advantage. But Scout was already alerting to new dangers, his hackles rising as the sound of diesel engines echoed through the complex. Their pursuers had arrived in force, not just the original SUVs, but additional vehicles carrying what sounded like a small army of mercenaries. "How many people are we talking about?" Owen asked as he helped Chen carry Rachel up the narrow staircase to the control booth. "Too many," she replied grimly, checking her service weapon and the extra ammunition she'd grabbed from her office. "But they'll have to come at us through limited access points, which evens the odds somewhat." The control booth was exactly what they needed, a fortified position with excellent visibility and multiple escape routes through the overhead walkway system. Chen immediately began positioning equipment to create makeshift barriers while Owen settled Rachel on a cushioned chair from the supervisor's desk. "Ray," he said gently, trying to rouse the detective to consciousness, "we need you to stay awake. Can you hear me?" Rachel's eyes fluttered open, focusing with obvious effort on Owen's face. "The evidence," she whispered, her hand moving weakly toward her jacket pocket. Did we get it to the right people?" "We're working on it," Owen replied, though he wasn't sure how they were going to accomplish that goal while trapped in an abandoned steel plant by armed mercenaries. Through the control booth's windows, they could see tactical lights moving through the complex as their pursuers established a perimeter around the main building. These weren't random searchers. They moved with military precision, clearing each area systematically to prevent any possibility of escape. Scout had positioned himself near the stairway entrance, his body language indicating that he would defend this position with his life. The dog's transformation from family pet to warrior had been complete, his loyalty to Owen's family extending to include Rachel and even Agent Chen in their makeshift pack. "Agent Chen," a voice called out from the smelting floor below, electronically amplified to carry through the vast space. "This is Commander Price, Blackwater Security Solutions. You're surrounded and outgunned. Surrender the fugitives and walk away." Chen moved to one of the booth's windows, her weapon ready, but held low. "Commander Price, I'm a federal agent in pursuit of suspects wanted for multiple homicides. You're interfering with a federal investigation." Price's laughter echoed through the building, cold and professional. "Agent Chen, your federal authority was revoked 47 minutes ago. You're now classified as a rogue agent harboring fugitives wanted in connection with terrorist activities." Owen felt his blood turn to ice. In less than an hour, they'd gone from federal witnesses to classified terrorists, their protection under law evaporating as quickly as morning mist. The conspiracy reached higher and had more resources than any of them had imagined. "Terrorist activities," Chen called back, genuine outrage in her voice. "These people are witnesses to government corruption and murder." "That's not how the paperwork reads," Price replied, his tone suggesting that paperwork was whatever his employers needed it to be. "You have 60 seconds to surrender before we come up there and collect you." Rachel struggled to sit up straighter, her determination overriding her physical weakness. "Chen," she whispered urgently, "the backup plan Tommy and I discussed. There's a journalist in Denver, Sarah Mitchell, at Channel 9 News. She specializes in government corruption stories." "How do we contact her from here?" Owen asked, looking around the control booth for any communication equipment that might still be functional. Chen was already moving her hands, flying over the booth's control panel as she brought dormant systems online. "This place still has internet connectivity for the security systems," she reported. "If I can establish a secure connection." The sound of boots on metal stairs indicated that Commander Price had grown tired of negotiations. His mercenaries were advancing on their position, with the confidence of professionals who'd handled similar situations dozens of times before. Scout's warning growl was the only alert they had before the first mercenary appeared at the top of the stairs, his automatic weapon sweeping the control booth for targets. The man's tactical gear and night vision equipment gave him significant advantages in a direct confrontation, but he hadn't counted on facing a 100-pound golden retriever with the heart of a lion. Scout's attack was swift and devastating, his powerful jaws clamping down on the mercenary's weapon arm, while his weight and momentum sent both of them tumbling back down the stairs in a tangle of man-dog and military equipment. The resulting crash echoed through the building like thunder, followed immediately by Scout's fierce barking and the mercenaries' screams of pain and surprise. "Scout!" Penny cried, starting toward the stairway before Owen caught her arm. "Stay back, sweetheart," he commanded, though his own heart was breaking at the sound of the dog's battle below. Scout had bought them precious time, but at what cost? Chen had managed to establish an internet connection and was frantically uploading files to a secure server. "I'm sending copies of everything to 3 different journalists," she reported, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "If we don't survive this, at least the evidence will reach people who can use it." More mercenaries were entering the building now, their tactical lights creating a maze of moving beams as they searched for alternate routes to the control booth. Owen could hear them coordinating through radio communications, their professional calm, indicating that Scout's fierce resistance had only temporarily disrupted their assault. Rachel pulled herself to her feet, swaying dangerously, but determined to contribute to their defense. "There's a service tunnel that connects to the next building," she said, pointing to a maintenance access panel in the booth's rear wall. "Tommy showed me the blueprints when we were investigating the complex for possible criminal activity." Owen helped her remove the panel, revealing a narrow crawl space that disappeared into darkness. It would be a tight fit for adults, but it might be their only escape route as the mercenaries' net closed around them. "Penny first," he decided, helping his daughter climb into the tunnel. "Then Rachel, then Chen, and I'll bring up the rear." But Rachel was shaking her head, her eyes filled with the determination that reminded Owen of Sarah during her final battle with cancer. "I'm not going to make it much further, Owen. My injuries are too severe and I'll only slow you down." "We're not leaving you," Owen replied firmly, the same words he'd spoken in the cave when she'd tried to sacrifice herself for their safety. "You have to," she insisted, pressing a small device into his hands. "This is a backup GPS locator that shows the burial sites of Henderson's victims. Combined with the audio recordings, it's everything the journalists will need to expose the entire conspiracy." The sound of Scout's continued barking indicated that the dog was still fighting somewhere in the building below, his courage buying them precious time even while outnumbered and outgunned. Owen's heart swelled with pride and terror in equal measure. Scout was proving himself to be the guardian angel that Sarah had always said he was. Chen finished uploading the files and began destroying the computer equipment to prevent the mercenaries from accessing their communications. "Upload complete," she reported. "Sarah Mitchell in Denver now has everything she needs to break this story wide open." Through the control booth's windows, Owen could see additional vehicles arriving at the steel plant. Not more mercenaries, but what appeared to be federal agents in standard FBI tactical gear. For a moment, hope flared in his chest before Chen's grim expression crushed it. "Those aren't real FBI agents," she said, studying the new arrivals through binoculars. The gear is right, but the deployment pattern is all wrong. Henderson's people are getting desperate. They're willing to impersonate federal agents to maintain their cover story. Rachel was fading fast now, her breathing shallow, and her skin taking on the waxy pallor that Owen recognized from Sarah's final days. But her eyes remained alert and focused, burning with the intensity of someone who refused to die until her mission was complete. "The tunnel," she insisted, pushing Owen toward the maintenance access. "Take Penny and get out of here. Chen can follow, but I'm staying to buy you more time." "Ray, no," Owen protested, but she was already moving toward the booth's weapon locker, her determination overriding her physical limitations. The sound of boots on metal stairs had resumed, indicating that the mercenaries had regrouped and were advancing on their position again. This time they would be expecting resistance and prepared for Scout's fierce protection. Scout's barking had taken on a different tone, still defiant, but tinged with exhaustion and pain that suggested the dog was fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds. Owen's heart broke as he realized that their faithful guardian was sacrificing himself to protect the family he'd sworn to serve. "Go!" Rachel shouted, firing her first shots down the stairway as tactical lights appeared at the landing below. "Get that evidence to the media before they can cover this up." Owen grabbed Penny and pushed her into the service tunnel, his heart tearing, as he was forced to abandon both Rachel and Scout to save his daughter's life. Behind him, Chen was providing covering fire, while Rachel held the stairs against the advancing mercenaries. The service tunnel was a nightmare of sharp metal edges and confined spaces, barely wide enough for an adult to crawl through on hands and knees. Owen pushed forward with Penny ahead of him, their progress marked by the sounds of gunfire echoing through the steel plant behind them. "Daddy, what about Scout?" Penny asked, tears streaming down her face as they crawled through the darkness. "Scout's doing what he was trained to do," Owen replied, though his own voice broke with emotion. "He's protecting us, just like your mom would have wanted." They emerged from the tunnel in the adjacent building, a smaller structure that housed the plant's electrical systems and maintenance equipment. Through the windows, Owen could see that the mercenaries had surrounded the main building, their tactical lights creating an almost daylight-bright illumination around the control booth. The sound of sustained gunfire indicated that Rachel and Chen were still alive and fighting, but Owen knew they were vastly outgunned and couldn't hold out much longer. Every second that passed was purchased with the blood of people who'd chosen to sacrifice themselves for justice. Agent Chen's voice came through on a radio she'd given Owen before they separated. "Owen, do you copy? We've bought you about 5 minutes, but they're bringing up heavy equipment. You need to get to a vehicle and get that evidence to Denver." "What about you and Rachel?" Owen asked, though he already knew the answer. "We'll hold them as long as we can," Chen replied, the sound of automatic weapon fire nearly drowning out her words. "Just make sure our sacrifice means something." Owen found a maintenance vehicle in the electrical building's garage, an old pickup truck with keys hanging from the ignition and enough fuel to reach Denver if they drove carefully. As he helped Penny into the passenger seat, the sound of an explosion rocked the main building, sending debris raining down across the steel plant complex. "Agent Chen," Owen called into the radio, but received only static in response. Through the pickup's rear window, he could see flames beginning to spread through the control booth area of the main building. The mercenaries had used explosives to end the standoff, eliminating the witnesses who could testify against their employers. But as Owen started the truck's engine and prepared to flee into the Montana darkness, a familiar sound reached his ears over the roar of flames and shouting voices. Scout's bark weaker now, but still defiant, still fighting to protect his family even in the face of overwhelming odds. Owen made a decision that would have made Sarah proud. Instead of fleeing immediately, he drove the maintenance truck toward the main building, following the sound of scouts barking to a loading dock, where smoke was beginning to pour through broken windows. The dog appeared through the smoke like a golden ghost. His coat singed and his left front leg obviously injured, but his eyes still bright with determination and loyalty. Behind him, moving with desperate urgency, came Rachel and Agent Chen, both wounded but alive. "I thought you were dead!" Owen shouted, jumping from the truck to help them climb into the cargo bed. "Takes more than a few mercenaries to kill a federal agent." Chen gasped, blood streaming from a head wound, but her service weapons still ready for action. Rachel was barely conscious, supported entirely by Chen's strength, but she managed to press another item into Owen's hands. "Insurance policy," she whispered. "Hidden camera, everything recorded, including Price's confession about the conspiracy." Scout leaped into the truck bed despite his injuries, immediately positioning himself to guard Rachel and Chen, while Owen drove them away from the burning steel plant. Behind them, explosions continued to rock the complex as the mercenaries destroyed evidence of their presence. "Where now?" Owen asked, as they reached the complex's main gate, noting that additional vehicles were converging on their location from multiple directions. "Airport," Chen replied weakly. "I have contacts in the Denver field office, people who aren't part of this conspiracy. If we can get on a plane..." But their escape route was already compromised. Black SUVs were moving to block the highway exits, their occupants coordinating through radio communications to create an inescapable net around the fleeing witnesses. Owen made another split-second decision, turning the truck toward a service road that led into the Yellowstone River Valley. The road was barely more than two parallel ruts, used primarily by ranchers and hunters who needed access to the remote areas along the river. "This isn't the way to the airport," Chen observed, though her tone suggested she trusted Owen's judgment, despite not understanding his plan. "We're not going to the airport," Owen replied, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead for the landmark he remembered from childhood camping trips with his father. "We're going somewhere Henderson's people will never think to look." The service road wound through increasingly rough terrain, forcing Owen to drive slowly to avoid damaging the truck's suspension on the rocky surface. Behind them, the lights of their pursuers had fallen back, suggesting that the mercenaries were reluctant to follow them into the wilderness, where their technological advantages would be neutralized. Scout's injuries were more serious than Owen had initially realized. The dog was breathing heavily and favoring his left side, suggesting possible internal damage from his battle with the mercenaries. But his eyes remained alert and focused, constantly scanning their surroundings for new threats. "There," Owen pointed ahead to where a cluster of lights marked a small ranch nestled in the valley. "The Morrison place. Jack Morrison was my father's best friend. If anyone can help us, it's him." But as they approached the ranch, Owen's heart sank. The lights were too bright and too organized, suggesting that this wasn't the peaceful family ranch he remembered from his youth. Henderson's people had anticipated his move, using their knowledge of local connections to set another trap. "It's an ambush," Chen confirmed her training, allowing her to recognize the tactical deployment of vehicles and personnel around the ranch buildings. "They know you better than we thought." Rachel stirred in the truck bed, her consciousness flickering, as her body fought to stay alive long enough to see justice done. "The old ranger station," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the truck's engine. 15 miles northwest. Tommy and I used it as a safe house during the investigation." Owen knew the place she meant. An abandoned fire lookout tower that had been built during the 1950s and forgotten when modern satellite monitoring made such structures obsolete. It was remote enough to provide temporary sanctuary while they figured out how to get the evidence to Denver. The drive to the ranger station was a nightmare of rough terrain and mechanical problems with the old maintenance truck struggling to navigate rocky slopes and fallen trees that blocked the primitive road. More than once, Owen had to get out and clear obstacles by hand, while Chen provided security with her weapon, and Scout stood guard despite his injuries. When they finally reached the ranger station, Owen was relieved to find that the building was exactly as he remembered. Isolated, defensible, and equipped with emergency communication equipment that might still be functional after decades of abandonment. The station consisted of a 2-story lookout tower with living quarters on the ground floor and an observation deck surrounded by windows on the upper level. Solar panels installed during the building's active years still provided limited electrical power, and a backup radio system offered the possibility of contacting the outside world. Owen helped carry Rachel into the ground floor living area, while Chen secured the perimeter and assessed their tactical situation. Scout limped alongside them, his determination unchanged, despite obvious pain from his injuries. "We can't stay here long," Chen observed as she examined the station's defensive possibilities. "This location offers good visibility, but we're trapped if Henderson's people find us." Rachel was fading rapidly now, her breathing becoming increasingly labored as blood loss and trauma took their final toll. But she fought to remain conscious, her eyes burning with the fierce determination that had sustained her throughout their ordeal. "The evidence," she insisted, gripping Owen's hand with surprising strength. "Everything we've gathered, the recordings, the photographs, the GPS coordinates, it has to reach the media before Henderson can create a cover story." Owen looked at the collection of devices they'd accumulated. Digital recorders, backup drives, hidden cameras, and documentation that painted a picture of corruption reaching the highest levels of law enforcement and government. It was enough evidence to bring down Henderson's entire network, but only if it reached people who could use it. "I'll get it to Sarah Mitchell in Denver," Owen promised, though he had no idea how he was going to accomplish that goal, while trapped in an abandoned ranger station with injured companions and limited resources. Scout had positioned himself near one of the station's windows, his ears perked and alert despite his injuries. The dog's behavior suggested that their pursuers were still searching, probably expanding their net to include all possible hideouts in the area. Chen was working with the station's radio equipment, trying to establish contact with federal agents who might not be compromised by the conspiracy. Her efforts were hampered by outdated technology and atmospheric interference, but she persisted with the determination of someone who understood that failure meant death for everyone in the station. "I'm getting something," she reported, adjusting the radio's frequency controls. "Weak signal, but it might be the Denver field office." But before she could establish clear communication, Scout's warning growl indicated that their sanctuary had been compromised. Through the observation deck windows, Owen could see lights moving through the forest below, multiple vehicles converging on the ranger station with military precision. "How did they find us so fast?" Owen asked, his heart sinking as he realized they were about to face their final confrontation with Henderson's mercenaries. Rachel struggled to sit up, her face pale, but her eyes filled with grim understanding. "The GPS tracker in the evidence devices," she whispered. "Henderson's people must have remote access to the tracking systems. They've been following the evidence all along." The realization hit Owen like a physical blow. Every piece of electronic evidence they'd gathered was broadcasting their location to the very people they were trying to expose. Their proof of the conspiracy had become the instrument of their destruction. "Turn them off," Chen commanded, but Rachel was already shaking her head weakly. "Too late," she replied. "And even if we could disable them, we'd lose the evidence that cost Tommy his life. Those recordings are the only thing standing between Henderson and complete victory." Through the ranger station's windows, Owen could see that they were completely surrounded by armed mercenaries who had learned from their earlier encounters. This time, there would be no dramatic escapes or last-second rescues, just a final accounting between justice and corruption in the Montana wilderness. Scout moved to stand beside Owen, the injured dog's loyalty unshaken, despite everything they'd endured together. Penny pressed close to her father's side, her small hand gripping his jacket as she tried to be brave in the face of overwhelming danger. Agent Chen checked her weapon one final time, her expression grim but determined. "At least we got copies of the evidence uploaded to the media," she said. "Even if we don't make it out of here, the truth will eventually come to light." But Owen wasn't ready to give up. Looking at his daughter's frightened face, Rachel's fading determination, and Scout's unwavering loyalty, he realized that sometimes the most important battles weren't won through superior firepower or tactical advantage. Sometimes they were won through the simple refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. As Commander Price's voice echoed through the forest, demanding their immediate surrender, Owen Carter prepared to make his final stand in defense of his family and the truth that had cost so many lives to uncover. The ranger station's lights flickered once in the Montana darkness, a beacon of defiance against the corruption that had infected every level of law enforcement. Outside, armed mercenaries prepared for their final assault, confident that overwhelming force would silence the witnesses who threatened to expose decades of criminal conspiracy. But inside the station, surrounded by the people and dog who had become his family through shared danger and sacrifice, Owen Carter wasn't thinking about defeat. He was thinking about Sarah's words echoing across the years with perfect clarity. "You can't walk past someone who needs help, Owen. That's not who we are." The truth needed help. Justice needed help. And Owen Carter had never walked away from someone in need. The standoff began at precisely 3:47 a.m. with Commander Price's mercenaries forming a perfect tactical circle around the ranger station, while Owen Carter stood at the observation deck windows, watching death approach with military precision. The floodlights they'd positioned transformed the forest clearing into a harsh theatrical stage where the final act of their desperate flight would play out under the Montana stars. "Owen Carter!" Price's voice boomed through electronic amplification, professional and cold as winter steel. "You have 60 seconds to surrender the evidence and walk out with your hands visible. This is your final opportunity to end this peacefully." Owen looked down at his daughter Penny, who sat beside Rachel's makeshift bed, where the dying detective fought to maintain consciousness through sheer force of will. Scout lay protectively between them, his golden coat matted with blood from his injuries, but his intelligent eyes still alert and watchful. "What do we do, Daddy?" Penny asked, her voice small but steady. Throughout their ordeal, she'd shown remarkable courage for an 8-year-old, never complaining, despite the terror and exhaustion that must have been overwhelming her young mind. Agent Chen was positioned near the radio equipment, still trying to establish contact with federal agents who might not be compromised by the conspiracy. Static filled the air as she worked desperately to reach someone, anyone, who could provide backup or at least document what was about to happen in this forgotten corner of the Montana wilderness. 45 seconds, Carter." Price continued his patience, clearly wearing thin. "My employers want this situation resolved quickly and quietly. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Rachel stirred on her improvised bed, her eyes opening with obvious effort. "Owen," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with urgent intensity. "The backup transmitter. In my jacket pocket. Tommy installed it in case we ever got separated." Owen found the device she mentioned, a small emergency beacon that could broadcast on multiple frequencies simultaneously. It was designed for search and rescue operations capable of transmitting location data and basic messages to any receiving station within a 100-mile radius. "What good will that do us?" Owen asked, though he was already examining the device's controls. Channel 7. Rachel breathed, her strength fading rapidly. Sarah Mitchell, monitoring emergency frequencies for breaking news stories. If we can get a message through. Chen looked up from the main radio with sudden understanding. She's right. Investigative journalists often monitor emergency bands for developing stories. If we broadcast on multiple channels simultaneously. 20 seconds, Carter. Price's voice cut through their planning. Final warning. Owen made a decision that would have made Sarah proud. Instead of surrendering the evidence that had cost so many lives to gather, he activated Rachel's emergency transmitter and began broadcasting on every frequency the device could reach. This is Owen Carter broadcasting from the abandoned Yellowstone River Ranger Station. He spoke into the transmitter's microphone, his voice carrying across the Montana wilderness to anyone who might be listening. We are federal witnesses in possession of evidence proving that Sheriff Jim Henderson of Glacier County, Montana, is involved in the murders of at least 3 women and the cover-up of government corruption reaching federal levels. Through the station windows, Owen could see Price's mercenaries reacting to his broadcast, their tactical lights suddenly focusing on the observation deck as they prepared to storm the building. The evidence includes audio recordings, photographs of burial sites, and documentation of payments to law enforcement officials from sources connected to federal land deals and environmental activist murders. Owen continued speaking rapidly as he heard boots pounding up the station's exterior stairs. Scout struggled to his feet despite his injuries, positioning himself between the family and the stairway that led to their sanctuary. The dog's courage had never wavered throughout their ordeal, and even now, facing overwhelming odds, he prepared to make his final stand in defense of the pack he'd sworn to protect. Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI is with us, along with Detective Rachel Brooks, who originally uncovered this conspiracy while investigating the disappearances of Jessica Winters, Maria Santos, and Carla Thompson. Owen broadcast as the first mercenaries appeared at the top of the stairs. The observation deck erupted in chaos as automatic weapon fire shattered the windows, sending glass cascading across the floor, where Penny lay protected beneath an overturned desk. Chen returned fire with her service weapon, her federal training evident in the precision of her shots that forced the mercenaries to take cover on the stairway. But Rachel was no longer able to contribute to their defense. The injured detective had lapsed into unconsciousness, her breathing shallow and irregular, as her body finally succumbed to the trauma she'd endured. Owen felt his heart break as he realized that the woman who'd sacrificed everything for justice might not live to see that justice served. The evidence has been uploaded to multiple media outlets. Owen continued broadcasting, even as bullets flew around him. Sarah Mitchell at Channel 9 News in Denver has copies of everything, including GPS coordinates of burial sites and audio recordings of Sheriff Henderson planning to eliminate witnesses. Price's voice came through a bullhorn from the forest clearing below, filled with frustrated rage. Cut the transmission lines. I want all communication from that station terminated immediately. But Owen's broadcast was already reaching its intended audience. Through the static and chaos, Agent Chen's radio crackled to life with an incoming transmission from the Denver FBI field office. This is Assistant Director Williams' Denver field office, a clear, authoritative voice announced. We have multiple units en route to your location. Hold your position and continue transmitting evidence details for the record. The tide of battle began to shift as the sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the valley, growing louder with each passing second. Through the smoke and confusion, Owen could see Price's mercenaries looking uncertainly at each other, their professional confidence shaken by the arrival of legitimate federal backup. Sir, we have incoming federal aircraft, one of Price's men reported through their tactical radio system. multiple helicopters, possibly a full tactical response team. Price's response was immediate and ruthless. Eliminate the witnesses now before federal agents can take them into custody. Use whatever force is necessary. The mercenaries' assault intensified with explosive charges, detonating against the station's ground floor, while automatic weapon fire raked the observation deck. But Scout's warning had given Owen precious seconds to position his family behind the station's reinforced communications equipment, thick steel housings that provided protection against small arms fire. Agent Chen had taken a bullet in her left shoulder, but continued returning fire with grim determination, her federal training evident in every calculated shot. "They're trying to destroy the building," she called out over the noise of battle. "We need to get to a more defensible position." But there was nowhere left to retreat. The ranger station was surrounded, its ground floor compromised by explosives and its observation deck under constant fire from multiple directions. They were trapped in a small space with limited ammunition, facing professional killers who had orders to leave no witnesses alive. That's when Scout made his final, heroic decision. The injured golden retriever looked at Owen with intelligent eyes that seemed to convey a lifetime of love and loyalty in a single glance. Then, with a courage that would have made Sarah weep with pride, Scout charged down the stairway toward the advancing mercenaries, his powerful bark echoing through the station like a battle cry. "Scout, no!" Penny screamed, but the dog was already among the enemy, his 100 pounds of muscle and determination wreaking havoc among men who'd been trained to fight humans, not a furious golden retriever defending his family. The distraction Scout created was exactly what Owen and Chen needed. While the mercenaries struggled to deal with the dog's unexpected assault, federal helicopters descended on the clearing, with searchlights blazing and loudspeakers demanding immediate surrender from all armed personnel. "Federal agents," the helicopter loudspeakers boomed. "This is the FBI. Lay down your weapons and surrender immediately." Price's mercenaries found themselves caught between Scout's ferocious attack from below and the arrival of legitimate federal backup from above. Several of them made the practical decision to surrender immediately, dropping their weapons and raising their hands as FBI tactical teams repelled from the helicopters. But Commander Price himself wasn't ready to give up. Drawing his sidearm, he advanced toward the ranger station with the desperate determination of a man who knew that capture meant life in federal prison. His target was clear: eliminate Owen Carter and the evidence that could destroy his employer's carefully constructed conspiracy. Scout intercepted Price at the base of the station stairs, the injured dog summoning reserves of strength and courage that seemed impossible given his condition. The confrontation between man and dog was brief but decisive ending, with Price's weapons skittering across the floor as Scout's powerful jaws clamped down on his gun arm. FBI agents stormed the station moments later, securing the scene and providing immediate medical attention to Rachel Chen and Scout. Owen held Penny close as federal medics worked to stabilize their injured companions, his heart breaking as he watched Scout receive emergency treatment for wounds that might prove fatal. "Is he going to be okay?" Penny asked through her tears, her small hand reaching toward the dog, who'd become the hero of their impossible journey. "Scout's tough," Owen replied, though his own voice was thick with emotion. "He's fought this hard to protect us. He's not giving up now." Assistant Director Williams arrived on the scene within the hour, his authoritative presence immediately taking control of what had become a complex federal investigation involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions. He was exactly what Owen had hoped for: a career professional whose reputation for integrity was matched only by his dedication to seeing justice served. "Mr. Carter," Williams said, approaching Owen and Penny near the medical triage area where Rachel was receiving emergency treatment. I want to personally thank you for the courage you've shown in bringing this evidence to light. Detective Brooks's investigation has exposed corruption that goes deeper than we initially imagined. Through the chaos of the crime scene, Owen could see federal agents cataloging evidence and documenting the mercenaries' equipment. Several of Price's men were already providing statements in exchange for reduced sentences, their professional loyalty evaporating when faced with federal prosecution. "What about Sheriff Henderson?" Owen asked, concerned that the architect of the conspiracy might escape justice while his hired guns faced the consequences. Williams smiled grimly. "Henderson was arrested 3 hours ago at a private airfield outside Kalispell, attempting to flee the country with several $1 million in cash and false identification documents. The evidence you provided gave us everything we needed for a federal warrant." Rachel stirred on her medical stretcher consciousness, returning as IV fluids and pain medication stabilized her condition. "Tommy," she whispered, her eyes searching for her murdered partner. "Did we get them? Did we get justice for Tommy?" "You got them all," Owen assured her, gripping her hand gently. "Henderson, his corrupt deputies, the federal officials who were covering for them. Your investigation exposed everything." Agent Chen, despite her shoulder wound, was already coordinating with federal prosecutors to ensure that all evidence was properly documented and preserved. Her dedication to seeing the case through to completion was absolute, even as medics insisted she needed immediate surgery to repair bullet damage. "The journalist in Denver, Sarah Mitchell," Chen reported to Williams. "She's already preparing a comprehensive exposé based on the evidence we transmitted. This story is going to make national headlines within hours." But Owen's primary concern wasn't media coverage or federal prosecutions. It was the injured golden retriever who'd saved their lives repeatedly throughout their harrowing ordeal. Scout was receiving treatment from a veterinary specialist who'd been flown in specifically for the dog's care, but his injuries were severe. "The internal damage is significant," the veterinarian explained to Owen and Penny. "He has broken ribs, internal bleeding, and extensive soft tissue damage. But he's fighting hard, and golden retrievers are remarkably resilient dogs." Penny knelt beside Scout's treatment area, her small hand gently stroking the dog's head as he fought for his life. "You have to get better," she whispered to him. "Mommy would be so proud of how you protected us." Scout's tail managed a weak wag at the sound of Penny's voice, his intelligent eyes focusing on her face with the same devotion he'd shown throughout their journey. Even critically injured, the dog's primary concern was for the family he'd sworn to protect. Over the following hours, the full scope of Henderson's conspiracy became clear through federal investigation and media reporting. The corrupt sheriff had been running a criminal enterprise that included not only the murder of young women, but also illegal land deals, environmental cover-ups, and the elimination of activists who threatened powerful interests. 17 victims over the past 5 years, Williams reported as dawn broke over the ranger station crime scene. Women environmental activists, journalists, who were getting too close to the truth. Henderson and his network were responsible for all of them. The federal case expanded rapidly as more evidence emerged and additional suspects were arrested across multiple states. What had begun as Detective Rachel Brooks's investigation into 3 missing women had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into corporate boardrooms and government offices at the highest levels. Sarah Mitchell's news report aired that evening, providing a comprehensive exposé that left no doubt about the extent of the corruption or the courage of the witnesses who'd risked everything to expose it. The story dominated national headlines for weeks, leading to congressional investigations and reforms in federal oversight of rural law enforcement. But for Owen Carter, sitting in a Denver hospital room 3 days later, the most important news had nothing to do with congressional hearings or media coverage. Scout had survived his surgery and was showing signs of recovery that his veterinarian called miraculous. "He's not going to be running through the mountains anytime soon," the veterinarian explained. "But with proper care and rehabilitation, he should make a full recovery. Golden retrievers have remarkable healing abilities when they have something important to live for." Rachel was recovering as well, her injuries serious, but no longer life-threatening. She would face months of physical therapy and psychological counseling to deal with the trauma of losing her partner and nearly dying herself. But her determination to see justice served had never wavered. "Tommy would be proud," she told Owen during one of his visits to her hospital room. "We got them all. Every corrupt official, every co-conspirator, every person who thought they were above the law." Agent Chen had already returned to duty, despite her shoulder wound, leading the federal task force that was dismantling Henderson's network and building cases against dozens of co-conspirators. Her dedication to the investigation had earned her a promotion and recognition from FBI headquarters, but she insisted that the real heroes were the witnesses who'd refused to be silenced. The media attention was overwhelming at first, with reporters and documentary filmmakers seeking interviews about their harrowing experience. But Owen was more interested in returning to normal life with Penny and Scout, rebuilding their family after the trauma they'd endured together. 6 months later, Owen stood in the backyard of their new home in Billings, watching Penny throw a tennis ball for Scout, who was running with only a slight limp to remind anyone of his heroic ordeal. The dog's recovery had been complete, his spirit unbroken by the violence he'd faced in defense of his family. The house was a gift from the Federal Witness Protection Program, along with new identities and financial support to help them start fresh in a safe location. Henderson and his remaining conspirators were all serving life sentences in federal prison, their criminal network completely dismantled by the evidence Owen and his family had risked everything to preserve. "Daddy, look how fast Scout is running," Penny called out, her laughter filling the evening air as the golden retriever bounded across their yard with the same enthusiasm he'd always shown for simple pleasures. Owen smiled, remembering Sarah's words about Scout being their guardian angel. She'd been right in ways she never could have imagined, and he knew she would have been proud of the courage their dog had shown in protecting the family she'd left behind. Dr. Margaret Wells visited regularly, having become something of a surrogate grandmother to Penny and a trusted friend to Owen. The elderly medic had faced no consequences for helping them escape her reputation in the community, too solid for Henderson's surviving allies to challenge. "That dog of yours is special," she observed during one visit watching Scout play with Penny in the backyard. "I've seen a lot of animals in my time, but I've never seen loyalty and courage like his." Rachel Brooks had accepted a position with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, using her experience and knowledge to investigate similar cases across the country. She visited Owen and Penny every few months, maintaining the bond forged during their desperate flight through the Montana wilderness. "How are you adjusting to federal life?" Owen asked during her latest visit. "It's different from small-town policing," Rachel admitted, "but the work is important. Every corrupt official we expose, every conspiracy we unravel, it's justice for victims like Jessica, Maria, and Carla." She paused, watching Scout demonstrate a new trick for Penny's delight. "And it's a tribute to Tommy's memory. He died trying to uncover the truth, and now that truth is making a difference across the country." The legal proceedings continued for over 2 years, with federal prosecutors building cases against every member of Henderson's network. The corruption had reached deeper than anyone had initially suspected, involving mining companies, logging interests, and federal officials who'd been willing to cover up murder to protect their financial interests. Commander Price and his mercenaries faced federal charges for attempted murder of federal witnesses, with several accepting plea agreements in exchange for testimony against their employers. The private security company that had employed them was dissolved, its assets seized to compensate the families of Henderson's victims. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the posthumous recognition given to Detective Tommy Martinez, Rachel's murdered partner. A federal courthouse in Montana was renamed in his honor, acknowledging his sacrifice in the pursuit of justice for victims who might otherwise have been forgotten. On the second anniversary of their escape from the Montana wilderness, Owen organized a memorial service for all of Henderson's victims. The ceremony was held in Glacier National Park, not far from where their ordeal had begun, with family members, law enforcement officials, and federal agents gathering to remember those who'd lost their lives to corruption and greed. Penny, now 10 years old, and showing remarkable resilience despite everything she'd experienced, spoke on behalf of all the children who'd lost parents to Henderson's crimes. Her words were simple but powerful, reflecting a wisdom beyond her years. "Bad people tried to hurt a lot of families," she said, standing at a podium with Scout sitting faithfully beside her. "But good people fought back, and now the bad people can't hurt anyone else. My mommy always said that when you see someone who needs help, you don't walk away. That's what my daddy and Scout and Detective Brooks and Agent Chen did. They didn't walk away." The memorial service concluded with the unveiling of a monument honoring Henderson's victims, their names carved in granite, alongside a bronze sculpture of a golden retriever that bore a remarkable resemblance to Scout. The inscription read simply, "In memory of those lost to corruption, and in honor of those who refused to remain silent." Owen knelt beside the monument after the ceremony, concluded, his hand resting on Scout's head as they paid their respects to the victims whose deaths had started the chain of events that changed their lives forever. The dog seemed to understand the solemnity of the moment, sitting quietly as Owen spoke softly about justice and sacrifice and the courage to do what's right even when it's dangerous. "We did it, boy," Owen whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We got justice for all of them." Scout's tail wagged once, a gentle acknowledgement that seemed to say he understood not just Owen's words, but their deeper meaning. The dog had been transformed by their experience just as much as the humans he'd protected, evolving from a beloved family pet into something greater. A symbol of loyalty and courage that inspired everyone who heard their story. As they walked home through the Billings evening, Owen reflected on how much their lives had changed since that stormy night when Scout had first alerted to Rachel's presence in the snow. They'd lost their anonymity and gained a profound understanding of how corruption could poison even the most trusted institutions, but they'd also discovered reserves of courage and determination they never knew they possessed. The book deals and movie offers continued to arrive regularly, but Owen had turned them all down. Their story wasn't entertainment. It was a testament to the courage of ordinary people who'd refused to let evil triumph, and he wasn't interested in profiting from the suffering of Henderson's victims. Instead, he'd established a foundation in Sarah's memory that provided support to families of law enforcement officers who'd been killed or injured while investigating corruption. Rachel served on the foundation's board, along with Agent Chen and several other federal officials who'd been inspired by their story. Dr. Margaret Wells had become the foundation's primary medical consultant, using her military experience to help families cope with trauma and loss. Her dedication to helping others heal reflected the same compassion she'd shown on that desperate night when Owen had appeared at her door, seeking help for an injured stranger. The Foundation's first major project was funding scholarships for children who'd lost parents to violence or corruption, ensuring that tragedy wouldn't prevent them from pursuing their dreams. Penny had suggested the scholarship program, arguing that education was the best way to prevent future corruption by creating informed citizens who couldn't be easily deceived. Tommy Wells. Dr. Wells's nephew, who'd helped them escape in his lumber truck, had become a regular volunteer with the Foundation's transportation services, helping families travel to court proceedings or medical appointments. His contribution to their survival had been crucial, and he remained committed to supporting other families facing similar crises. Agent Sarah Chen had been promoted to lead the FBI's expanded Rural Corruption Task Force, a federal program created in direct response to the Henderson case. Her work had led to the investigation and prosecution of corrupt officials in dozens of counties across multiple states, breaking up criminal networks that had operated with impunity for decades. The Henderson case changed everything, Chen explained during a foundation fundraising event. It showed us that corruption in rural areas wasn't just a local problem. It was connected to national networks that required federal resources to combat effectively. She paused to watch Scout demonstrate his therapy dog skills with children whose parents were serving overseas, the Golden Retriever, having been certified to provide emotional support to families dealing with trauma and separation. But more than that, Chen continued, it showed us the power of ordinary citizens who refused to be intimidated by corrupt authority. Owen Carter and his family could have stayed silent, could have tried to forget what they'd witnessed. Instead, they chose to fight for justice, and that choice saved countless lives. The ripple effects of their story continued to spread, inspiring reforms in law enforcement oversight and federal investigation procedures. Congressional hearings had led to new legislation requiring federal review of suspicious patterns in rural missing person cases, ensuring that future victims wouldn't be forgotten or ignored. International law enforcement agencies had also taken notice, using the Henderson case as a model for investigating similar corruption in their own countries. The story of a single father, his daughter, and their loyal dog standing up to government corruption had resonated far beyond American borders, becoming a symbol of resistance to tyranny and injustice worldwide. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. On Scout's 5th birthday, 2 years after their Montana ordeal, the American Kennel Club presented him with their highest honor for heroism, the first time in the organization's history that the award had been given to a dog who wasn't specifically trained for law enforcement or military service. Scout represents the best qualities of the Golden Retriever breed, the AKC president announced during the ceremony. Loyalty, intelligence, courage, and an instinctive desire to protect those who cannot protect themselves. His actions during the Henderson investigation exemplify everything we hope to see in the human-canine bond. Scout accepted the award with typical Golden Retriever grace, his tail wagging enthusiastically as children from the audience were invited to meet him and hear about his adventures. His story had become a favorite in elementary schools across the country, inspiring young people to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. As evening approached on that special day, Owen sat on his back porch, watching Scout play with Penny and several of her friends, the dog's energy and enthusiasm showing no signs of diminishing despite his advancing age and the trauma he'd endured. The Golden Retriever had not only survived their ordeal, but had thrived, becoming an even more remarkable animal through his experiences. The phone rang, interrupting Owen's peaceful observation of the backyard festivities. Rachel's voice came through clearly, calling from her FBI field office in Washington, where she was briefing congressional investigators about a new corruption case her team had uncovered. "I wanted to call and wish Scout a happy birthday," she said, her voice warm with affection for the dog who'd saved all their lives. "Is he enjoying his party?" "He's in heaven," Owen replied, watching Scout patiently allow a group of 5-year-olds to decorate him with birthday ribbons and bows. "I think he enjoys being the center of attention." "He's earned it," Rachel said simply. "Have you given any more thought to that documentary proposal, the one that wants to donate all proceeds to the foundation?" Owen had been considering the offer for months. Unlike the commercial entertainment proposals he'd rejected, this documentary would focus on the victims of Henderson's crimes and the systematic reforms that had resulted from their exposure. All profits would support the Foundation's work, helping other families facing similar crises. "I think Sarah would approve," he said, finally making his decision. "If it helps other families and honors the victim's memory, then we should do it." The documentary, when it was finally completed 2 years later, won several awards for investigative journalism and social impact. But more importantly, it led to additional legislation strengthening federal oversight of local law enforcement and providing better protection for witnesses who reported corruption. Scout made several appearances during the documentary's promotional tour, his presence serving as a powerful reminder of the loyalty and courage that had made their survival possible. The golden retriever had become something of a celebrity, but he seemed most comfortable when he was simply being a family dog playing with Penny, or accompanying Owen on their daily walks through their Billings neighborhood. On quiet evenings, Owen often found himself thinking about the chain of events that had started with a simple drive to visit his mother during a Montana blizzard. If Scout hadn't alerted to Rachel's presence, if they'd driven past without stopping, if they'd chosen to remain silent about what they'd witnessed, how many more people would have died at Henderson's hands? "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd made different choices," he admitted to Dr. Wells during one of her visits. The elderly medic smiled, watching Scout demonstrate his latest trick for Penny's friends. "You made the only choices your character would allow," she replied. "Sarah raised you to be the kind of man who doesn't walk past someone in need, and she raised Penny the same way. Scout was just being himself, loyal, brave, and protective of his family." "But the cost," Owen said, thinking of Tommy Martinez's death and Rachel's near-fatal injuries, the trauma Penny had endured, and the months of danger they'd all faced. "The cost of doing nothing would have been higher," Dr. Wells replied firmly. "Henderson's killing would have continued, more families would have lost loved ones, and corruption would have spread even further through law enforcement. Sometimes the right choice is also the hardest choice." As Scout's story became more widely known, the golden retriever received hundreds of letters from children around the world, many of them facing their own difficult situations. Owen and Penny made it a weekly tradition to read some of the letters together, with Scout sitting between them, as if he understood the importance of his correspondence. One letter from a young girl in rural Kentucky, whose father had been threatened for reporting local corruption, particularly moved them all. "Dear Scout," she wrote, "my daddy says bad people are trying to hurt him because he told the truth about the sheriff. I'm scared, but I remember your story, and I know good people can win if they don't give up. Please tell Penny I'm trying to be brave like she was." Owen contacted federal authorities about the Kentucky situation, and within weeks, FBI agents were investigating the corruption the girl's father had reported. The case led to the arrest of several local officials and the implementation of federal oversight for the county sheriff's department. One letter. Rachel marveled when she heard about the Kentucky case. One child who was inspired by Scout's story, and it led to justice for an entire community. It became clear that Scout's impact extended far beyond their original ordeal. The dog had become a symbol of resistance to corruption and injustice, inspiring people around the world to stand up for what's right, even when facing overwhelming odds. On Scout's 10th birthday, Owen organized a celebration that brought together everyone who had played a role in their survival and the subsequent fight for justice. Rachel flew in from Washington, Agent Chen took leave from her duties with the Corruption Task Force, Dr. Wells made the drive from Clearwater Falls, and even Tommy Wells brought his family up from Kalispell for the occasion. The celebration was held in Glacier National Park, not far from where their ordeal had begun a decade earlier. The setting seemed appropriate, a place of natural beauty and peace where they could reflect on how far they'd all come since that terrifying night in the Montana wilderness. 10 years ago, I was a single father just trying to get my daughter safely to her grandmother's house, Owen said, addressing the gathered friends and family. I had no idea that stopping to help a stranger would change our lives so completely. He paused to look at Scout, who sat calmly beside him with the dignity of a dog who understood his importance to everyone present. Scout taught us that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right, even when you're terrified. He showed us that loyalty means never abandoning those you love, no matter how dangerous the situation becomes. And he demonstrated that sometimes the smallest act of kindness, stopping to help someone in need, can have consequences that ripple out far beyond anything you could imagine. Penny, now approaching her 20th birthday and preparing to start college with a full scholarship, funded by the foundation bearing her mother's name, spoke next. Her words reflected the wisdom and strength she'd gained from their shared ordeal. Scout saved our lives in the Montana wilderness, she said, her hand resting on the golden retriever's head. But more than that, he showed us how to live with purpose and meaning. Because of him, we learned that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. The celebration concluded with the dedication of a new monument in the park, honoring not only Henderson's victims, but also the law enforcement officers like Tommy Martinez, who died in the pursuit of justice. Scout participated in the ceremony by laying a wreath at the base of the monument, his solemn demeanor suggesting that he understood the significance of the moment. That evening, as they returned to their Billings home, Owen reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. They'd survived corruption, violence, and betrayal, but they'd also discovered the power of truth, courage, and unwavering loyalty. Most importantly, they'd learned that standing up for justice, no matter how dangerous or difficult, was always worth the cost. Scout spent his final years as a therapy dog working with children and adults who'd experienced trauma similar to what their family had endured. His gentle presence provided comfort to countless families, and his story continued to inspire people facing their own battles against injustice and corruption. When Scout finally passed away peacefully, at the age of 14, surrounded by the family he'd protected and served so faithfully, the outpouring of grief and gratitude was overwhelming. Letters arrived from around the world, sharing stories of how Scout's example had inspired people to stand up for what's right in their own communities. The funeral service was held in Glacier National Park, with hundreds of people attending to pay their respects to a dog who had become a symbol of courage and loyalty. Federal agents, journalists, corruption investigators, and ordinary citizens who'd been inspired by Scout's story all came to honor his memory. Scout was more than a dog, Agent Chen said during the service. He was a reminder that heroism comes in many forms, and that the bonds of family and loyalty can overcome any obstacle. His legacy will continue to inspire people fighting for justice around the world. Owen buried Scout near Sarah's grave in the family plot they'd established in Billings, a peaceful spot overlooking the Montana landscape that the golden retriever had loved so much. The headstone bore a simple inscription, "Scout Carter, guardian hero friend. He never walked away from someone who needed help." In the years that followed, the foundation continued to grow and expand its mission, helping families across the country who faced threats for reporting corruption or standing up to injustice. Penny took over its operations after completing law school, dedicating her life to continuing the work that Scout's courage had made possible. The FBI's Rural Corruption Task Force, inspired by the Henderson case, had investigated and prosecuted hundreds of corrupt officials across dozens of states. Agent Chen, now in charge of the program, regularly cited Scout's story as an example of how ordinary citizens could make extraordinary differences in the fight against corruption. Rachel continued her work with federal investigators, her expertise in rural corruption cases making her one of the most respected agents in the Bureau. She never married, dedicating her life to ensuring that victims like Jessica Winters, Maria Santos, and Carla Thompson received the justice they deserved. Dr. Margaret Wells passed away at the age of 92, surrounded by the extended family of people whose lives she'd touched through her compassion and courage. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people she'd helped over the decades, including Owen and Penny, who considered her one of the most important influences in their lives. On the 20th anniversary of their escape from the Montana wilderness, Owen returned to the ranger station where they'd made their final stand against Henderson's mercenaries. The building had been converted into a museum dedicated to the fight against government corruption, with exhibits detailing their story and the reforms it had inspired. Standing in the observation deck where Scout had made his heroic charge against overwhelming odds, Owen could almost hear the golden retriever's bark echoing through the years, a sound of defiance and courage that would never be forgotten. The museum's guest book contained entries from visitors around the world, many of them sharing their own stories of standing up to corruption and injustice. One entry from a young police officer in rural Montana particularly moved Owen. Scout's story taught me that being a good cop means more than following orders. It means having the courage to do what's right, even when your supervisors want you to stay silent. I will never forget his example. As Owen prepared to leave the museum, he noticed a family with young children examining the exhibits, the parents explaining to their kids about the importance of standing up for what's right. One of the children, a girl about Penny's age when their ordeal began, looked up at him with recognition. "Are you Mr. Carter?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "Scout's dad." Owen smiled, remembering how Scout would have loved meeting this curious young visitor. "Yes, I am. My teacher told us about Scout," the girl continued. "She said he was the bravest dog who ever lived, because he never gave up protecting his family." "She's right," Owen replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Scout taught us that real courage means never abandoning the people you love, no matter how scary things get." The girl nodded solemnly, then brightened with a child's natural optimism. "When I grow up, I want to be brave like Scout." Owen watched the family continue through the museum, the children listening intently as their parents explained the importance of truth and justice and standing up for what's right. He realized that Scout's legacy would continue through these young people and countless others who'd been inspired by his story. Walking out of the museum into the Montana sunshine, Owen felt Sarah's presence as clearly as if she were walking beside him. He could almost hear her voice warm with pride and love. "You did good, Owen. You and Scout and Penny. You all did exactly what needed to be done." The golden retriever who'd saved them all was gone, but his spirit lived on in every act of courage, every stand against injustice, every decision to help someone in need rather than walking away. Scout had taught them that heroism wasn't about being fearless or invincible. It was about loving someone enough to fight for them, no matter what the cost. As Owen drove home through the Montana landscape that held so many memories, he understood that their story wasn't really about corruption or conspiracies or federal investigations. It was about the unbreakable bonds between a father, his daughter, and a golden retriever whose love and loyalty had changed the world. Scout was no longer running beside their truck or sleeping at the foot of Penny's bed, but his legacy would endure forever in the hearts of everyone who'd learned from his example. He had been exactly what Sarah always said he was, their guardian angel watching over them with 4 legs and an unlimited capacity for love. And somewhere in the Montana wilderness, where the wind whispers through the pines and the streams run clear and cold, Owen Carter could swear he sometimes heard the sound of Scout's joyful bark, calling them home to a place where courage and loyalty and love triumph over all the darkness in the world.